Okay, so just like last time, I'll remind you that this is not a private conversation, but is ultimately going to be made available to the public. We want this to be an enjoyable experience, so if at any point I guide us into a topic that you don't want to talk about, just let me know and we'll switch to something different. And my role is to talk as little as possible and let you be center stage and tell your story.
Okay.
So today is Tuesday, May 14th, 2019. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm interviewing Steve Seaberg for a follow-up interview here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And before beginning, if I can just get your verbal confirmation and consent to be recorded.
I give you my consent, Andy.
Perfect. And before we get back into it, I wanted to make a correction of a mistake that I made in the last interview when we were talking about your children and raising them here in Atlanta. I had asked a question of whether you knew of or were friends with Hugo Black and his wife and raising their children. It's Hector Black. I always, I've made that.
You know, I felt I had some feeling that was wrong, but I've heard his name him called Hugo by other people for some reason, but you're right. It's
I think the notable historical figures, Hugo Black, I think, was a Supreme Court justice.
That may be the problem, yeah.
So Hector Black was the person that I was trying to recall, and just for the record, wanted to make sure that...
But I want to say something about that too, and I hope that I didn't go too far in talking about people's private lives when it came to adopting children in that particular part of that interview. I don't want to say more about it now, but I just want to say I think that I didn't. I mean, in adoptions, of course, some people try to keep certain information secret. It's not common among people I know, but that does happen. And I felt that when I talked about Hector having a child that was adopted by one of our friends, that it would be okay to do that. But thinking back on it, I just want to say that that sort of information sometimes the people involved do want to keep it private. In this case, I simply don't know. I made an assumption that they didn't, so I could.
Yeah, and I don't specifically recall that.
Right, but I did name these people, and I thought later that maybe I had. But knowing the people, I also thought that they would not mind. Like my wife, and when we adopted our first child in New York, there was a real need, as there always is, for adoptive parents. And they asked us, particularly if children of mixed race, that seemed to be the biggest problem, because black families were not adopting children that were of mixed race at that time. So they had a campaign to do that, and so they asked us, would you be willing to be in a newspaper article telling about your experience? And we of course said yes. So within a week we were in the New York Times with our daughter Selena talking about mixed race adoptions. So that attitude is pretty much the attitude of people we know. They were not trying to make copies of themselves or pretend that children were not adopted, but we're talking more openly about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do adopt children of other races than yourself, there's no way to say, this is my biological child. Although that's not true. There are so many interracial couples now that have both adopted and have their own children, and it's hard to tell really who is who, and you know. Anyway, let's get on with, that was an interesting point. Glad you brought that up, because I thought of that later.
Mm. So I have several things that I wanted to follow up on from our previous interview,
Sure.
and then I wanted to talk at some length about the great speckled bird.
Okay, back to that, eh? Well,
Yeah.
I can do that.
And then we can range widely.
Okay.
So the first thing I wanted to ask about, how would you describe your sort of political, social coming of age?
Well, I didn't really know at the time, but my grandmother, and one of them particularly, and her daughter, my mother, were very active in the women's suffrage movement. Had been in parades, and I mean, as a kid, this in the 30s, this meant little to me. But I later found out that they had marched with the, suffragettes. And even though our general family background was Republican, because my grandmother was a writer and my father too, there was certainly a feeling of, let's look at the objective truth about things first. What do they call it now? Evidence, evidence-based.
Mm.
Although I had a grandfather who was a Methodist or Baptist minister, and there was various people that had been members of strange groups, and not cult-like groups, but the usual thing. But the big change came with the Depression, which was sort of like the year before I was born, in 1929, and I was born in 1930, and by 31 and 32 it was in full swing, and it was clear that the only way that it was going to be changed was that the Democrats would have to be voted in, and Roosevelt was voted in. And at that time, my parents, including my maternal grandmother, just changed and voted Democratic, and pretty much continued to vote Democratic for the rest of their lives. And my mother later even became an election judge, that is, a person that sits in the election, and watches the polls, and so forth. So I grew up with this feeling that that one should be politically active, really from the very beginning. And there were some of our relatives that did not change their opinion and continued to be conservative Republicans, and certain arguments started. And at one point, my grandmother said to her nephew, said, "I can't stand this anymore. Please leave the house. I don't want you to come here anymore." And as a kid, I understood this they were quite boring, these people, and my grandmother was very impatient with boring people. So I thought, even then as a little kid, that she had thought this up as a great way of getting rid of these two people. And I ran to the door, Andy, and opened the doors to be sure they left, because I thought they were pretty boring too. So that was the only dramatic moment in the family, is when the Jamesons were told to leave. So from then on, I was pretty much, I got into arguments with my friends in high school over Roosevelt. And one of my Republican friends didn't speak to me for a year, and later I realized that was stupid. I never should have, had that argument. He and I now talk again many years later, but we don't talk about politics. I have no idea what he thinks about that. Anyway, that was pretty much that's the explanation.
And did your family's influence and the participation of your mom and grandmother in suffragism did that sort of manifest in any ways for you as you're in high school, college?
Yes, it got me into arguments with Republicans, for one thing. Well, my behavior and interests in high school and college weren't dependent on that. That was just a symptom of how people in my family thought. I mean, 2 people in my family had been inventors, not very successful, but there was an idea that that sort of thing was okay. It was okay. I had an uncle who was a concert pianist. That was okay. I mean, these all sort of alternative careers were okay. I mean, you could do that. You could be an artist. My mother was, you could be a journalist. There was no push to go into business or be a business entrepreneur. So there was a lot of discussion at the dinner table about everything. I mean, arguments about anything. So that people would get up from the dinner table and say, I'm going to look that up. I'll show you what the truth is. And then the next person would get up, and I sometimes would be the only person left at the table. All the adults would have disappeared into the living room looking up things in books. There was even accusation that my step-grandfather would make up references that weren't true, that nobody could check. But this was an atmosphere that anybody could have an opinion of any kind, but it could be challenged too. So I sat and listened to all of this for years as a little kid. And I think that certainly the idea that I could work for the Bird was easy. I mean, I had a journalism background. I was thinking freely about politics, or was even progressive or leftist, although I never was a communist or took a stand on that. I certainly was interested in socialist art criticism, which I had found one book on. I don't think there are any more than that I know of in English, and applied it at the Bird. I used these theories, and I enjoyed doing that. So it had a big influence on, I mean, working for the Bird, for instance, and everything else I've done. I mean, I've taken stands on all sorts of stuff that have been unpopular because I thought, but I've also met lots of other people, like-minded people, not just that worked for the Bird, but the people in Atlanta that the progressive thinking people of Atlanta, I know them all. I knew them all.
But even earlier than that, were your opinions, your viewpoints pretty solidly established, or in flux, like when you're in your 20s with the civil rights movement coming into its own and really into national prominence, and then with the war in Vietnam?
That wasn't really that apparent then to a person living in a mostly white suburb of Chicago. However, the town I lived in had a very the largest Jewish population of any Chicago suburb. At one time we had 3 temples, so very, both conservative and reform, and I knew all these people, and had even been to services. I'd been to a bar mitzvah already at one of my friends when I was 12, and so I was really familiar. And my first love was a Jewish girl. I would meet her as I went to church, and she went to the synagogue. It was pretty exciting. Anyway, and she would change her route and go some other way. That annoyed me. Anyway, that had a lot to do with liberal thinking. I mean, if you know people of different religion, that's a big thing. I mean, if you know Muslims, for instance, you don't go around bad-mouthing Muslims because you know one of your friends is a Muslim. So the idea of, like, if somebody asked me, what do you think of Jews? I would say, well, what do I think of people? Because that's what they're like. There were a lot of kids I didn't like who were Jewish, but there were lots who were my best friends. And I think that atmosphere gave me a certain freedom and thought about religion, seeing these people, and therefore I was interested in college, for instance, or even in high school, in studying things that were sort of mind expanding in the sense that you were now going to see things you'd never thought of. And luckily I was in a sort of fast class in high school, so we got to study ancient history. And that doesn't sound like much, but it sure gives you a perspective. My friends were studying American history and sociology, but they did not start, with the Egyptians and the Sumerians, and I thought that was absolutely wonderful. But it was also very mind expanding to have a background in history that went back a couple, 3,000 years, made a big difference, I think, in how I looked at the world in general. So when I took courses at Northwestern, I was interested, even though I didn't major in it, I took several anthropology courses. It's what would be called now cultural anthropology, or was called that then. And these also were very mind expanding, taking what was called primitive music. It would never be called that now because it was all the music of the world outside of Europe and the United States. So we actually studied Chinese and Indian music, which meant so much to me just as a musician too. And so when I looked at the culture around me in Chicago, I began to see how this was also there, right under our very eyes, were cultures going on that we had, most of my friends, not their fault, but they had little knowledge of. So even as a freshman in college, I found one of my best friends was another musician, and we would go out into the city looking for jazz clubs and played with other musicians, many of whom were black. And that was another world. I mean, absolutely different from the middle class, mostly white college atmosphere of Northwestern at that time. Mm-hmm. So anthropology became a kind of window on the world that I used to expand. But if I already didn't want to do that, I never would have done it. I mean, I was taking anthropology because I found that was a place I could do this. I could look at other cultures and that's that for mostly that I can think of. And it led, of course, to us being in this Wim Wenders movie, The Soul of a Man, because when I went to Europe, and of course every time I found a piano, I would sit down, even in a French restaurant in the corner, and play boogie-woogie and stuff to entertain myself. Because I missed it. I missed that music. And so when my wife and I came back to Europe, to the United States, after a few weeks in Evanston, when I got this job as a teaching assistant in the art department, she said, "What about the blues? What about this music? Where is it?" And I sort of went, "Well, you're right. Why are we wasting our time?" And we went out to a record store we knew carried black blues and jazz, and said, "What's going on?" And the owner, his name Bob Kester, said, "Well, there's a rent party, as they call it, in this weekend at a certain place," meaning you would go and pay a fee to get into the apartment, which would then be used to pay the rent there. But it was also a way of musicians getting a venue, a place to play. So we went and almost immediately met J.B. Lenore and Willie Dixon and Sonny Len Slim and little brother Montgomery. I mean, all these people were there, and they came to our house. they were eager too, as we were, to expand their audience. And they were right, we helped expand their audience, so we knew them, they became our friends. And that probably wouldn't have happened if I hadn't started out so early as I mean, it was certainly through music and art that I got involved with them. Ending up making a film with JB, and that film 40 years later getting into the Vendors movie, and an interview with us, which you can also see on YouTube somewhere. When the show was done on PBS, I mean, it was broadcast, or whatever they call it now, our mailman said he was sitting watching this show, and he was about to get up and get a beer. And at that moment, they showed me and my wife in the archival, footage. So we were 40 years younger. And our mailman said, he saw us and said, I know those people from somewhere. And in the next second, the film switched to us now in an interview. At the age he knew us, and he said he never got his beer. He never got up after that. But it's pretty funny. So that was exciting when our mailman saw us on TV. We were, but that was a result in a very long, it took a long time for it to happen, but that certainly was a result whose roots went back long before that, into my childhood. And the fact that my parents had a collection of lots of records from the 20s and even earlier, many of which were jazz records, and I listened to these as a kid and thought they were really exciting and tried to play like that. I even had a jazz band in high school, I remember, and we played music that was written in like 1918 by the original Dixieland jazz band. And I'm still sort of obsessed with that. I sit now and practice playing the Memphis Blues by Handy's, and this band that played with us in the recent Inman Park Festival also, of course, like practically all musicians, black or white, play jazz. I mean, you got to do it. It's the most interesting music yet. So I'm sure in the next month or so, will probably play with them or get them. I mean, I can see that as another direction that I want to follow. It's a long answer. You asked me good questions, Andy, and
You're a thoughtful respondent.
Yeah, I like, my daughter sometimes says, I plan too much, but I say, but that's fun, I like it. I don't think too much about stuff. Because things are so connected, it's fun and exciting to see the connections. I mean, and as an artist and a teacher, I had to teach about archetypes a lot. I mean, to say, because artists have been so influenced forever by art before them. I mean, the Renaissance wasn't the only time that artists discovered stuff from, 1,000 years before. I mean, they're always, it turns out that practically all blues musicians know the history of blues. They can play like Jelly Roll Morton can play Scott Joplin. I mean, he knows the history of piano music. And even these guys that are sitting down that sound very primitive and simple actually are very sophisticated and have heard, they all know their predecessors. And artists do that too. Not only do we study that in schools, but we make it a point to see that. Going to a museum, you see immediately the connections between your own art and things in the past. The whole idea of these naked things is also to connect with the past. I mean, if you take off your clothes and stand, get up on the cross, you are suddenly gaining some power. It's a way you've connected yourself now with an age-old archetype. And that's what we're trying to do in that book, is connecting ourselves with a kind of archetypal power. Jung, this whole theory of this archetypes, that's what he believes in, that we think in terms of some sort of, it isn't Platonic ideals, but some other idea. I never understood exactly what he meant, but it's about how we think in terms of these archetypal forms.
Mm. And the book you were referencing is this book that you brought in today, that is photographic documentation of some performance pieces that you and your wife and friends did in between 2004 and 2006.
Right. And a lot of these people that are in that are quite well known in the Atlanta art world, actually. We weren't just, in fact, well, that's another story. I won't go into that right now. But we all knew what we were doing. We knew we were doing that. We knew we were trying to, like Rose's idea. The first idea was this Last Supper. That wasn't mine. And she wanted to redo the Last Supper and make our connection with it, which we did. And what we decided was our connection, was pretty funny in many cases, but pretty serious. I mean, we wanted to be there and look like those people from biblical times. Of course, we got bored with it pretty quickly and got into other things. And I thought, what is it that Hieronymus Bosch, what has he got in that painting? There's something really good in that. I mean, it's one of the world's most interesting paintings. And a way to find out is to try to do it ourselves. Let's see how you feel when you are doing something, imitating Hieronymus Bosch. Like recently, and not long ago, I did a whole series where I imitated the naked guys in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. They're characters that have nothing to do with the Bible. It's just that he liked to paint naked men, and he did it. He just figured out, and at that time it was okay. So here are these 25 or 30 men in every different pose you could think of. So I set up a camera in my living room and took my clothes off and tried to imitate all these guys. And what was interesting was that even though I certainly wasn't as young as they, because he was so good at anatomy, that if I just took that pose, I looked like them. I mean, remarkably, I won't say I got 10, 20 years younger, but almost something magic happens when you get into somebody else's skin like that. I mean, it's like acting, kind of, I don't know what kind of acting. It's called tableau vivant in art, when you try to imitate some work of art. And it's a very popular thing to do, and artists like to do it, obviously. Boy, is that a long answer.
Sort of related to that, I wanted to follow up. Last time we talked, you did talk a bit about music, particularly blues and jazz, and its influence on you. And now we're talking about visual art and the ways that you have engaged some of that, particularly in the last couple decades. Were there other books or films, artists, cultural figures
Absolutely.
that had a big impact on you and your thinking?
My first idea of the only thing worth doing or seeing in a movie was slapstick comedy. I remember when I was a Boy Scout, Cub Scout, so I was like 9 or 10 and I had a terrible cold. And somebody showed us a movie in some, I don't know why, you know, one of these get-togethers called Bakers Needing More Dough. And I think Chaplin was in it, although I had no idea who he was. And it was these guys and women making bread in a basement bakery, and it was just full of, it was just absolutely the scream. And I had never seen anything so funny. And I was rolling, coughing, and blowing my nose and rolling on the ground. And I thought, this is what life should be about. And there was one thing that certainly is now politically incorrect, is these women were trying to get up the stairs. The guys were pushing them up, but their hands had flour on us. You could see their handprints on the women's behinds on their dresses. And I thought that was terribly funny, and it was a model for me. I thought, that's what, you know, that really making fun of everything. And eventually they put a bomb into the oven by mistake, and it blows up, and I mean, it was pretty corny. So I went with that and saw every comedy I could see, and I mean, Chaplin, everything else. And then when I was about 20, I guess, of course, I had gotten interested in sex in the meantime, and there isn't so much sex in these comedy things except putting your hands on women's behinds with flour on them. And I went to see a movie in one of them, Chicago's many foreign language theaters. I had gone to see German films, and which were, you know, that nobody else would see because they were all in German. And I thought it would help me in my German class in college. And then I went to see a movie that was called Torment, and I'm sorry to say I thought this was going to be some crazy sex movie. And I went, and it was a Swedish movie, and it was about a high school boy who's in love with a woman in a cigarette store, but it turns out that her real lover is his math teacher. And that's pretty, you know, corny too in a way, but it was the first movie I understood that movies could also depict my feelings, not just comedy, but my deeper, you know, jealousy and love and all that sort of stuff. So I was really taken with that movie and started to see as many Swedish movies as I could. And it wasn't until years later that I found out that the writer of the movie was Ingmar Bergman. He had never made a movie himself, but he had written the story. This was his story. And the movie was made by a guy named Alf Sjöberg, which is my name in Swedish, not the Alf part, but the Sjöberg. So I felt this connection, and I went to see more, little by little saw more Swedish movies, some good, some bad, but all of them quite open about sex and feelings. I mean, compared to American movies that had a tendency to be a lot of drama, but not much in it about how you really felt. And I found out later that these same movies are being seen by other people, artists of my age, all over the country. And we're having this same effect that life, love, sex, and nudity were all part of the same thing. They were not to be treated with anything. I mean, we were all like, this is the way we are, sort of thing. So later, I began watching, so eventually I think probably saw every Ingmar Bergman film there was. And of course, my wife and her friends were also interested in Sweden. I mean, he was a great influence on all of us of that particular age because of his openness and, well, he was often very funny too, actually. Then it turned out that my wife was sort of related to him. Sweden isn't a very big country, but she had a cousin who was also cousin to Ingmar Bergman.
Mm-hmm.
So Ingmar Bergman's grandmother and my wife's cousin's grandmother were the same person, but he wasn't related, a blood relation, however that works. Anyway, this cousin, Nils or Nis, he lived with my wife's family because his own mother had died and his father was apparently ruled incapable of taking care of him. So the grandmother, the one that was also grandmother of Birdman, traveled around Sweden and visited various relatives and chose my wife's family as the family where Nissa should live. And so he did live there for many years until he joined the Navy or something. And she said, he used to talk about somebody named Putte, which sounds as silly in Swedish as it does in English. It's a kid, sort of baby talk name. His cousin Putte, who put on these little theater performances, and Nisse would be the light guy. They're just little boys. And nobody knew who Putte was until we all grew up, and it turned out there was Ingmar Bergman was Putte, who was already making little plays, with cardboard figures and stuff. I mean, this is really aside from the facts, but it's interesting, to know that you can get that close to a person, and you feel maybe that had some influence. I don't know. But anyway, those were certainly big influences. Plus, all of American theater, and American theater is full of different stuff and movies. I mean, really interesting ideas. The minute I got to college, I joined the Film Society and just started to see all of the classic movies from the very beginning, the Lumiere brothers on, the Chien de Lou, and packed that into my head and made use of it whenever I could do that. So even the movie we made of J.B. Lenore, which was not cut, we couldn't afford, we just didn't have time. We had only a couple of lights, but we knew how to make it simple. We knew that we had to make it simple because we didn't have any money and any time. And so its simplicity was part of its charm and interest when it appeared in Wender's bigger movie. And its sort of naivete was so strong that the film critic in the New Yorker magazine said that the film within the film, which it was called by a lot of people, was better than the film itself. And I don't quite agree with that, but it was very flattering to us who he didn't know. I mean, we're completely unknown people. We made no other movies that they know of. And Wenders, who's really a smart, nice guy, still talked about us as, he called us students, film students. Well, we weren't. We were in our 30s, and we were both really sophisticated. We'd seen art all over the world. We'd seen, and he appreciated our film, but he still wanted to call us students, and I was always objecting to that. We were not students. I mean, I had read both of, what's the Russian director, the famous Russian, the guy who made Alexander Nevsky and Potchomkin, and the guy from the 20s, or anyway. I'd read both his books on movie theory. I mean, this was heavy duty stuff, and about the only thing ever written from it all in the beginning about movie theory. So I always felt that Wenders was undervaluing us in this. We really had brought a lot of sophistication into knowing what not to do with this movie of J.B. Lenore. So that certainly goes back, to Ingmar Bergman and all that stuff. I mean, the fact that I wanted to open up my mind to all of this stuff. I found it exciting to do. I mean, I felt often that in Chicago, I was, certainly if there was an avant-garde, I was in it with other people I knew, with other Chicago artists. And that gave me a pleasure. I mean, a feeling not of self-importance exactly, but being part of a larger cultural picture, which I still feel I am, you know, like this Inman Park Parade. I felt I was doing my, my damnedest to bring this acrobats into this otherwise pretty, what's the word I want? Not pedantic, but ordinary. Well, it's not an ordinary parade, but anyway, you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. And the Inman Park Parade, this is an annual
Yeah.
neighborhood festival
And it's pretty big. And
that you participated in
it's-
just a couple weeks ago.
And a lot of my friends, a woman actress, they call her an actor now, who was in these pictures we just looked at, was impersonating Donald Trump in this parade 2 weeks ago with a wig. So it isn't just me that's going on, but these same people in that book are still out there doing something different now. It's sort of fascinating. Okay, it's your turn, Andy. I've come to the end of my string on that one.
So to follow that thread, or what you ended with Atlanta and your friends and art scenes, I wanted to hear your thoughts of how you would describe what I think of as sort of the social and cultural mood of Atlanta when you moved here.
Boy, that's a really good leading question. We came here partly to get away from New York, which was getting so polluted. I mean, literally, you didn't want to live there and thought this is no good for kids. And we had a friend in the building that said you should go and teach art at Morehouse. So without, I mean, this is really immature behavior, without even finding out if I had a job, we packed up, went to Atlanta, stayed at the Pascal's Motel which was a famous place. We didn't know that, for meetings of political black politicians, and found out that Morehouse didn't have an art department. I should have. I'm glad I didn't find that out, because here we were anyway, and I applied to all of the colleges in the AU Center, the historically black colleges and universities, and then we went to Florida because I didn't have a job here, and we might as well have some fun. So as my wife and our two little kids went swimming every day, I sat in this apartment with roaches that fly, I'd never seen them before, and wrote letters to various colleges trying to get a job. And suddenly got a phone call from Clark College, as it was called, that they had a job in a program that would introduce African and Afro-American culture into these historically black colleges that for years had been teaching the same kind of classic culture curriculum that other white schools have been doing. So that was right up my alley. That's exactly the sort of thing I'd been already doing at Rutgers. I'd already been trying to get them to have, study. I don't know. So I knew little of the rest of Atlanta. I didn't know where Decatur was for a couple of years until one of the other faculty members invited us for dinner and drove us to Decatur. Really exotic. And at that time, Andrew Young had become, was he a representative in Congress, and Maynard Jackson was just about to run for mayor. And if you wanted to, black or white, if you were a faculty member associated with the AU Center and you wanted to be in politics, you could do it. I mean, I played the guitar and sang songs at Jackson rallies and marched with protests with Jose Williams, and you could do all that stuff. And you met these people, and you became part of this, and that was how I started out in Atlanta. And little by little, I met these other progressive white people, and that's how I got in contact with people that worked for the Bird. But culturally, Atlanta was really essentially only white on the surface officially, like the Arts Festival, which was a pretty big deal, had no black participation. I mean, nothing. There weren't black artists exhibiting in it. It sounds incredible now, but it's true. So after I worked for the Bird, which is also a completely white organization, I got a job in the Neighborhood Arts Center, which was created by Maynard and his Department of Cultural Affairs, which was mostly black musicians, dancers, who were paid by a government program called CETA, which meant we had to do some teaching, but we also had studios in this old school building on Abernathy, as it's now called, and I taught there and worked there for about 3 years. Now with really the first black arts organization outside of the AU Center. Of course, there were artists there, but there were no artists even studying at GSU. I know the woman who was the first black art student. This was, like in
the late 70s.
70s, yes. There had been no. So the Neighborhood Arts Center decided we must show at the Arts Festival, but we will, and I don't know who, this was sort of ingenious, they said, we'll take the pier in the lagoon, the lake, and turn it into our separate gallery, and we did.
And this is at Piedmont Park?
Yes, and so during the festival you could see the art of African American artists by going to the pier, and here we had set up kind of roof, a parachute, and we had all sorts of stuff, and that was it. That was the introduction of black artists into the Arts Festival. Sometime later, I don't think it was that year.
Because this is you worked at the Neighborhood Arts Center between 1976 and 79, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
So this was very likely 77 or something like that. And so that was quite a big deal. And maybe a year later, I got into a show in what they call the bathhouse. It's a really tacky place, but that was where there was a juried show. So that was sort of the fanciest place to be in the Arts Festival. And it wasn't a booth, it wasn't. You could also have installations. There'd be about 10 or 12 people who had installations, and I did that too. But the bathhouse show was interesting because I simply said to the people that were running, I said, you have no black artists in the show, and you must, I said, must, you better do it. You should have a black artist in the show. And I knew a guy that was now sort of a guest artist at the Neighborhood Arts Center named David Hammonds, who became a friend of mine, also came from Illinois. And I said, you should have David in the show. I mean, his work, and they realized that they better. So here in the bathhouse were all these paintings and art around the wall. And then as you came to the door where you'd come in, and now we're about to go out, here was David's work over the door. And it was just like a joke, it's like the black guy sits next to the door in the office. They had, it's so simple-minded, had put David's work as close to being outside the show as they could get it. The next work to his was mine. So they had not punished me, I won't say that exactly, but a little bit like that, like, you're the one that made us do this, you're going to be next to the door too. So David and I were the last works you'd see as going out. David later got the MacArthur Fellowship, $1 million, and this is the sort of person that had to be had to threaten them to get him into the show. He had work eventually in the airport, and they'd still be there. So this is what I wanted to tell this story today. I thought this was so important. This was the first, I mean, Atlanta, no black teachers at GSU, no art in the arts festival, no murals by black people. They had a mural project going on, but all the muralists were white, even when they invited them in from other parts of. And I was going around and simply saying to my white brothers and sisters, you better show work of black artists pretty soon, and they got really mad at me. I mean, I see these people still. We've all grown elderly and we hug and kiss, you know, we don't go back to the time. You know, when they said, you're just Johnny One Note, they said, all you do is talk about integrating, you know, you really nasty guy. So I think that's a really important story.
And were you, I guess, by association, sort of categorized alongside black artists? Like you talked about the pier, and you were like, and this is where all the black artists were exhibiting this first time, but you were in the show too.
Yes, and a couple of other white artists who worked at the Neighborhood Arts Center. And they're still around too. There were a few of us who, I think maybe 3 of us, who were there. So at the same time, another group started, which was called Nexus, which has now become the Contemporary. And they also were getting CETA funds, but they were all white, absolutely, no. And we once invited them to show with us at our place down in Mechanicsville or Pittsburgh, that's where we were. And I guess they said they did. The day came of the show and they weren't there, and we thought, oh well, they're just a bunch of white people. I mean, I thought like that too, that don't want to do it. But suddenly a truck drives up into the parking lot and filled with their art, and so here they are. So we all show together. That was definitely our idea, that we wanted, you know, integrate this all. There was, the mayor had got this committee called the Mayor's Committee on the Arts. I think that, I don't know, the chairman was not Michael Lomax, but some other guy, a white guy that worked for Maynard. But eventually Michael Lomax, Pearl Klieg's husband, who was teaching at Morehouse, became the cultural affairs director, and it became a big department, much bigger than it is now. And they started mural projects and started to get federal money for public murals and public performance. And that's how the whole black arts in Atlanta started, was with Jackson and this, the department, the Bureau of Cultural Affairs it was called. Now it's called the department. And we were certainly all part of that, in the midst of that sort of thing. And when he started the Mayor's Committee on the Arts, he said anybody could belong, so I just went and joined it. And of course these guys, there were people on it like Ivan Allen III, and you know, a lot of big dealers in Atlanta who wanted to be part of this, and here I was, completely unknown, you know, artist. And of course I also stirred that up by, you know, saying, once they wanted to appoint Ivan Allen III to something, and I objected and said, he just told us to leave, Nexus to leave the building because he was going to raise it. And I said, is that the sort of person we want? It's just destroyed one of our, and there was a silence, and then he was not voted in. So I had this certain effect. I was like their conscience. And I did that quite a lot, and I was not popular because of this. They wished that I wasn't around very often. And these changes were bound to come anyway. It wasn't my doing. It was just that I often spoke up for these things that were going to be pretty obvious. But we certainly were part of a change. And now you see black murals everywhere, and artists. There's still a segregated art scene, but it isn't the way it was. And suddenly GSU, after Joe Perrin left, had a black chairman to the art department, Larry Walker. So things changed at GSU. I mean, schools began, I think the Atlanta College of Art had a sculptor, Curtis Patterson, whose work was then put up around town, so a lot of black artists got work in public spaces. But there was still a struggle going on. I mean, when they built the federal building, what's it called? It has a name. Anyway, they said their lobby was now open to any artist that wanted to show there. And of course, it's an enormous glass windowed lobby. I mean, it's a big, so I said, yeah, I want to be that person. So I took all my strange wooden sculpture over there and put it up. Oh God, it was fun to just fill the lobby with this weird stuff. And the minute I got home, I got a call from the building manager who was just beside himself and said, you can't put that stuff all over here. You're spoiling the space. Well, of course, they just didn't want any real art there. They didn't know what they were doing. They wanted to look good, but when they saw it actually there. So I had to go back, and he said, you can put it behind these potted plants over here. So I had no choice. It was foolish. I just moved it all into a corner behind the potted plants. The second artist to have a show was a black artist whose specialty was just showing his paint cloths. I mean, the drop cloths that you would put down, so there was just lots of splashes and stuff. And he would hang one of these things on the wall and say, that's my art, So he was the next artist, and he was having his, I shouldn't laugh, but he was having his piece was now lying on the floor, ready to be put up. And the cleanup people came and threw it in the dumpster of the Richard B. Russell building. And of course, they were such, I only laugh because it showed up their complete ignorance of art and they didn't at least throw my stuff away. But the next, and they never had an art, I don't think they ever had art in that building again.
And was this in the 1990s? Or?
Yeah, something like it. It was just the year after it was opened, the Richard B. Russell building. And I haven't heard of any art there yet since that time. I wish I could remember this guy's name. I really sympathized for him, but it was so typical, throw it in the dumpster. So they had to drag it out of the dumpster and put it up. And of course, that's sort of what you wanted, in a way. An artist that shows that kind of thing is trying to make a point about trash and art and whatever the difference is. So maybe it's what he really wanted. I don't know. I mean, artists are weird people, I admit. If this answers your question about what the atmosphere was about art when I arrived, that's it. That was the changing point. The Neighborhood Arts Center and Maynard Jackson's, this was the big turning point. But it was happening all over the country, actually. I mean, it wasn't just here. There was a feeling that this was time to do this. The remains of this, there's still repercussions, though. John Riddle, who was the chairman, the head of the Neighborhood Arts Center, who had come from Los Angeles to do something else, and since he was here, he was an artist, he was made director. What he had come to do was make a piece of sculpture commemorating the 13 black legislators that were elected right after the Civil War. He made a statue and then kicked out almost immediately when the Reconstruction came. And he made a piece of bronze statue which was put on the grounds of the state capitol. And there was a story about that too. When they put it up on the east side of the capitol, and he said, but that's not the front. Nobody goes there. That's not the side. And they said, oh yes, it's the traditional front. And this is such a white people's ploy to have some excuse for putting this on the wrong side where nobody would see it. It should have been on the side where, what's his name, you know, stands with his finger pointed and all the white politician statues are. Well, when they made this new statue of Martin Luther King for the state capitol, this is how many years later? God.
Yeah, because that's just within the last 2 or 3
Yeah.
years.
It was last year almost. 'Cause
Yeah.
Anyway, I went to that and it was packed with people because it's now okay to put up statues to black people. Nobody, I don't think, saw it when John's thing was put up at all. This new statue replaces his statue. Instead of adding to it, they took away John's statue to the 13 guys and put Martin Luther King's statue sort of like on top of it. And I asked him, where is, I don't know who I asked, but what have you done with his John's statue? Oh, well, they're planning to put it somewhere. Yeah, but where? You know, where's it going? And this is the same struggle going on. Why couldn't they have added it and to the statuary and not taken away the one? And the newspaper said this is the first statue of a black poet, you know, and it's not true. You know, there was this other one there. And I don't even know if the artist for this recent one was black or white. I have no idea. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a white guy. So, what do they say in Portuguese? La luta continua. The struggle goes on. So, Andy, that's the end of that
So,
lecture.
if that's a nice description of the cultural and arts world in the 1970s coming through the present, you and your wife set up residence and have lived in West End over by the Atlanta University complex since you moved here.
Yes.
Describe that neighborhood at the time and what it was like to...
Well, it was a white neighborhood. I mean, as the Wrens nest where Joel Chandler Harris lived, who wrote Uncle Remus. And of course he was white. And as older white people moved out, black people started to move in. Not just black, but a lot of these people, like myself, who felt connected. I mean, it was also near the AU Center, and we'd even looked at it when we first came here and wondered if we would eventually live here. And it was cheap. I mean, I won't even tell you what I paid for the house. It's so scandalously low compared to what people want to offer me now for it. But it was a bad neighborhood. There were people, there were gunshots and...
Was it still predominantly white when you moved there, or had it transitioned?
No, it had been changing. It may never have been completely white, I don't know. But very short, a lot of people moved in who worked at the AU Center, worked for the city, black people, educated people, professionals. And right away, pretty soon we decided we wanted to make it an historic district, which we managed to do. And our children grew up together, and most of our children then went off, didn't go to the local high school, but went off to Northside, which was the arts magnet school, sort of. There were so many kids from West End that went there that a bus came just down from Northside to West End to pick up all these kids that were going there to high school. My daughter, was in the dance program at Northside. My son did theater technician. There are people now on television, like, what's her name, Guy, who became quite well known in the entertainment field that were going to Northside at that particular time. So the neighborhood changed. And at one time, we had lots of poets living there, and somebody opened an art gallery on Abernathy, or Gordon as it was called, and we had poetry readings there, my wife and Alice Lovelace, and then a whole bunch of other poets. So we had quite a cultural scene going on in the 70s and even 80s in West End. It was kind of a cultural center for a while, and people moved away and got older, and now we're all, a lot of us are still there, now elderly, and our children have gone other places, so it no longer, and yet there is now a kind of gallery where there are musical events. In that same place we had our gallery, so things are picking up a little bit. But it was people who were associated with the AU Center and the arts and the city, like city architects, and Jocelyn Dorsey, who is a personality and TV personality, still lives across the street. And because of the Neighborhood Arts Center, I got to know Shirley Franklin and Pearl Klieg and lots of people in the arts. And my daughter was the Franklin's babysitter for a while, and David Franklin would drive up in a Mercedes in front of our house and pick her up, and drive her off to. And so we had connections with these people that went on beyond the Neighborhood Arts Center. And later, now I have no longer. Once Maynard Jackson came to visit, see Jocelyn Dorsey, and got out of his car, and I just happened to be standing in front of my house, which is a few doors away, and he looked at me, he knew who I was, and he looked at me and said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I live here, Maynard, this is my house." But so you see, even that was unexpected to some people. That wouldn't have been strange to people in West End. I mean, we were lots of people who were white and black all living together who knew each other. Maynard lived somewhere else and didn't realize this was going on there. Yes, Jocelyn Dorsey sewed my daughter's graduation dress, and we had all sorts of contacts like that, interpersonal and intercultural contacts. Was that an answer to your question?
Yes, it was.
What was your question, Andy?
I was just asking about what it was like and what the sort of social world was like moving into West End, particularly as a white person in the early 70s.
Right, so the fact that we wanted to make it into a historic district also brought us together a lot. So we had endless committee meetings to do this, and being the artist, I got to decide whether we would have a rule about what you could paint your house. And also being artist, I thought, I'm not going to tell people what to, no, I'm sorry, of course, I don't want to see any more purple houses with yellow trim. But at the time, it seemed like the right. But a typical person who would be in that group would be Janet Sykes, who was either head librarian or at least a librarian at the Auburn Library. And so it was that kind of people who were professionals and engaged in. Also in African American culture, or culture in general, and Handy Young, Handy, what is his last name? Johnson, who was an landscape architect for the city, lived around the corner and stuff like that. So we had lots of professional people, both black and white. A man that taught at Grady, taught English, and lived down, a white guy down the street. And his kids grew up like mine, thinking of themselves as West Enders, that's where they were from, regardless. Even though I guess it was a majority black population, it still had people like that in it, who sometimes moved away, sometimes stayed. There was a gay couple behind us, sort of our best friends in the neighborhood, and both of them worked for a black newspaper. One was a white guy, Bill Cutler, worked for The Voice, I think it was. And Edmund, his partner, was a photographer and often our babysitter. I remember my son, for some reason, doing what 13-year-olds do, carved in his door in the house, "No fags." And I get furious at him. I said, first of all, I don't want anybody carving on the doors in the house, period, whatever it is. And I said, I don't want anybody carving things like that. And I said, do you realize that Edmund, the man you like the most of our neighbors, maybe love the most, is gay? And my son was dumbfounded. He had never thought that Edmund, he never considered this, but that was an important movement in his life, I know that. Anyway, Bill and Edmund lived behind us, and we had bought our house because they lived there. They had asked us, they had lived on Seminole and said, we don't like it anymore, where can we move?
Seminole over like
Right.
the Ponce Highlands.
Right.
Yeah.
And I said, why don't you move to West End? And they did. They found a house, and we came to a party there once and sat in their backyard and drank a good deal and said, wouldn't it be more fun if we just could crawl over that fence to our own house and wouldn't have to now take the bus home to, well, we lived a little far away, but not there. And they said, well, that house is for sale. So within 2 weeks, we had bought the house, and we did just crawl over the fence from then on to go home after parties with Bill and Edmund.
How did you meet them?
That's a wonderful story. We, through the people we knew, this was, there was a guy, white guy named Kelly Morris, who started a theater. It was almost downtown. I don't know, it was, God, right near where Georgia State is, somewhere where we are now. I just don't know, because it was so different then. It was an old warehouse, a seed store, and he called this Feed and Seed Theater. Mm-hmm. And he started putting on plays, and a band started, which we now know as the Marching Abominables, the Feed and Seed. They started at that time, and they have continued from that time, and many of them are that old. Anyway, there was a woman, his wife, what's her name, was of course also Morris, had a dance group, and somehow we met, somebody who was in the dance group and got to know them, and one of the dancers now had a cousin who lived on Seminole with his black partner, and that was Bill Cutler. So we got to know Bill, and that's how we knew them. Through, what's her name, Morris's dance company. Bill Cutler had been a professor at a rather, not Swarthmore, but a rather swanky Eastern girls' school, I think near Philadelphia. What would that be? Bryn Mawr? No,
Bryn Mawr?
Possibly. But it decided, the way some people do, to become another person. So he destroyed his driver's license, all identification, got on a bus and came to Atlanta, sort of like putting your finger on the map and saying, I will go there, and got a job at Green's liquor store somewhere, and lived, I don't know where, and tried to disappear and become a new person. Well, the first person to walk into the liquor store was a guy who was the husband of this dancer we knew. And he took one look at Bill and said, let's see, what was Bill, his original name was not Bill Cutler, but, oh, it'll come to me. Anyway, this guy walked in and said, so-and-so, you know, there you are. And that was the end of Bill's anonymity. Everybody called his mother and his partner, Edmund, who is back in Philadelphia. And Edmund came, and his mother came, and that was the end. It didn't last very long because if he just didn't have a job in a liquor store, it would have never happened. So that's how we knew Bill, and Edmund they both got jobs working for this black newspaper, The Voice, and Bill also wrote articles for The Bird, of course. He was a big bicycle enthusiast and was one of the first people to start the bicycle movement in Atlanta. Many times he said he ended up spread eagle on people's, you know, on their hoods of their cars, because that's where you went when you were hit by a car.
Mm-hmm.
He had a project to get all of Atlanta storm gratings turned so that the slots were not in line with the bicycle tires as you came, because your tire went into that slot. And he wasn't successful. He got a few of them turned sideways, but he died of AIDS. He was one of the early people to do that, and I designed his quilt, which I have a picture of. When they were all laid out in Washington on the mall at one time, somebody went there and found his and took a picture of that quilt with the Capitol in the background, which I still have. That's I think, and it was sewn by another friend of his. I didn't. So it had a bicycle wheel and a feather. It's a little corny. A feather meaning a writer, and then this bicycle wheel, and so on. So that was another Atlanta experience we got involved in. And he was a rose fancier and had a lot on our block where he had something like 98 antique rose bushes. And I inherited those. It was like inheriting the crown of thorns, because it demanded incredible work, and I came back, I spent a whole day weeding it and come back, you know, like Christ covered with bloody, because it turns out that rose bush thorns face in, and you can crawl in under, but when you start to come out, they're all against you. So I would come back muddy and bloody, and they only bloom like every May for a few weeks, and so the rest of the year they're just a job you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
I finally sold a lot, but only after a few years, and gave what bushes were left to neighbors, and there are a few left in the neighborhood, but not many. But I kept up Bill's memory, you know, almost at the cost of my own life for many years.
Did Edmund stay in the neighborhood?
No, he had actually, no, wait a minute. Edmund had actually died several years before of a heart attack.
Mm.
So he was not, Bill had a second partner who was okay, but certainly not our friend like Edmund. Yes, Edmund was eating. Bill wrote a lot. He wrote restaurant critiques. So he and Edmund were always out eating somewhere. And I believe it was one of these restaurants that Edmund actually died of a heart attack, which was a great blow to all of us. And then Ed found this other, Ed, that's the name of the, yeah, that's strange. His second partner's name was Ed too. Never thought of that. And that was part of the Atlanta experience at that time, was if you knew, and there were several gay couples and people on our block. There was another guy that was certainly not, he was pretty funny, but it's because he drank a lot. And he would stand in front of his house, Paris. He was a great friend of my daughter. They were terribly nice guys. And Paris would stand in front of his house, and if a shot rang out somewhere in the neighborhood, he always had a drink in his hand. He would say, well, I hope they got him. So we were also part of the gay experience to that extent that many of our friends in the neighborhood were gay.
Yeah, and Bill was one of the few participants in the Bird that wrote on gay life and culture.
See, so you know who he is already from reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, I can't, as I think about him, I will remember more what he did, but you're absolutely right. Bicycles, gay culture, restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
His father was a really well-known editor who was the editor of some well-known writer, not well-known to everybody but me, apparently now. I'll remember it eventually. His name was Aswell. That was Bill's name, Duncan Aswell. So you can see why he changed it to Bill Cutler from Duncan. And I mean, he was just the perfect Eastern elite person who wanted to not be that person. So that when his cousin's husband walked into Green's, he said, Dunk, because that was his nickname for Duncan. And that's when the game was up, when, what was his cousin's husband's name? Oh, it'll come to me. Anyway.
And maybe you said it, but do you recall what he was teaching? You said he was a college professor.
English.
English.
Yes, I know. He was an English teacher. As a writer, I mean, that was his specialty. He knew literature very well. At his memorial service, which became the popular way to do it among the artistic of Atlanta and everywhere else, was not to have a funeral, but a kind of party where you read poetry and stuff like that. I remember somebody sang Ave Maria, and I had to accompany them on the guitar. It was hell because I'm not a bad guitar player, but I had to do it right. And it was strange that many years later, when my wife had died, I had to do the same thing in Sweden. And we have a niece who's an opera singer, so I had to really... So I went to Sweden, and I just spent all my time practicing Ave Maria on the guitar. That seems to have been my fate at these parties. Ave Maria. It's a good tune, though. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you have Bill in your list of people, because he was a really important cultural figure, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and when I started looking at the Bird and noting people and sort of the roles they played, and I remember asking a couple people early on in interviews, and they let me know that unfortunately
he would have been probably the only person writing from that point of view, too. I can't think of anybody else.
Well, there was another man, Miller Francis.
That was a different, I didn't know him.
Who wrote, and Burl Boykin.
Burl, of course I know Burl. Well, I shouldn't laugh. I laugh because I know too much about all these people. I have a friend alive now who was a great friend of Burl's, and he has a million stories to tell about Burl. I have to tell you, this is so interesting. This is a new story. This guy, Bob Darby, I'm talking about, who was actually a man who founded the Food Not Bombs Atlanta chapter here, and had nothing in particular to do with it. He was probably interviewed for the Bird, I don't know, but he also knew Burl and was really a good friend of Burl's, and a great admirer of Burl's, because he said Burl was the smartest man he ever met in his life. This guy, Bob Darby, lived in Ormwood Park, and finally had to give up his house because it's just too hard to have renters. One time he came back to his house and the police were there arresting 2 of his 3 tenants two of them, not just one, you know, and he decided it was too much. So he sold his house and moved into Brannan Towers in East Atlanta, where he's lived for about 7 years. And also a place that's practically predominantly black people. It's him and a woman who is with the Feed and Seed band lives there. That's interesting. This Bob, for the last year, got in touch online somehow with a woman who lived in Iowa, and they became friends, and she lived in a town called Nemaha that nobody's heard of, and even I from the Midwest, because there are only 85 people in it. They decided that she should come and see him in Atlanta, and that took a long time, but she finally came. Just before I went to Chicago, she arrived in her pickup truck to see Bob and stayed with him a couple of days in his one-room apartment in Brannan Towers. And in 3 days they got married. And I haven't met her yet because I've been out of town. So Bob is now married this woman that he met online. And they're both like 72 or something like that. It's like a new life starting for this guy. It's very strange. I don't know what she's going to be like, but she better be able to stand Bob. That's all I got to say. Why did I tell that story? But that goes along with Burl Boykin.
Yeah.
Oh, and the Bob was also a friend of Dolores French, the woman who came to me to get me to write this story about not hookers, but about strippers that caused one of the editors at the Bird to quit. She got so mad. One of the lesbian editors got mad at me. I think she wanted to quit anyway. All these people that do stuff often have other reasons.
Mm.
So who else do we have from the Bird that we can talk about?
Well, tell me more about Dolores. Did you know Dolores before working at the Bird, or?
Yes, that sure is an interesting story. Because I was a musician, I met musicians, and there was a group of people called the Jive Ass Jug Band, in which that's where I first met John Jacobs, because he played guitar. And there was another woman named Toni Schifolo who played washtub bass, a real washtub. I didn't know how they worked until I saw her really play it. She is also in many of these naked pictures. And there was another group, and I don't know how they were connected, called the Deluxe Vaudeville Orchestra, which a guy named Roger French had, and Tony played bass in that. I don't think John played in that, but other people I knew that were also in the Marching Abominables played in that, and his wife was Dolores. Roger, it seems impossible. I shouldn't talk like that, but I mean, anyway, that's how I met Dolores as Roger's wife, and that's why her name is still, they're divorced, but her name is still Dolores French. And that's how I met Dolores.
But she also did volunteer her time, work at the Bird.
Probably, yes. Oh, no, I don't remember, Andy. I can't remember that. But
No, I've heard from other people that
she did.
Yeah, that she would spend some time around the Bird. I'm not sure what her role was.
No,
but she's a really prominent figure.
She's a prominent figure because she then became a prostitute and started to write and take up the plight of the prostitutes. Now, this is where I have to go real careful on my opinions of all of this. But she characterized herself as, I shouldn't use the word character, that doesn't sound right, but she called herself I don't know what, certainly not the queen of the prostitutes, that's wrong. I have to ask her, she's still around, I see her all the time. But a lot of her friends are a little confounded by this, you know, a lot of people didn't think that being a prostitute was really a good idea, and that some people, I must admit, didn't even believe she was, but were just taking on this role. This is where I have to be careful, because I see Dolores not real often, but 2 or 4 or 5 times a year at least.
But she did form, or was involved in forming a group, wasn't it called Coyote? Was that?
I don't know, I can't remember.
It was an organization advocating for the rights of sex workers.
Right. Well, yes, that's exactly what she was doing. You put it very well. Advocating for the rights of sex workers. And of course, most of us would agree with that. I mean, I'm not prejudiced against sex workers, and they should have rights. I agree. I didn't know what they were called, though. But the guy who made the video didn't take the pictures you've seen there, but took lots of pictures of me doing other stuff. Jeff Thies is also a friend of Dolores. And when Jeff has a dinner party, which he often has, and he lives in the Stewart Lakewood Heights area of Atlanta, Dolores is often a guest, and she's even painted, she's a painter too, and has painted the outside of his house to some extent. Well, my friend Bob Darby, I gotta stay out of this. Anyway, Bob Darby, who just married the one from Nemaha, is also an old friend of Dolores and knew her from an earlier time, but they're not really friends anymore. Anyway, this is quite a bunch, and it goes on, and you know. So Bob is very upset about the homeless, and of course I told him about coming here and having almost to step over the homeless to get into Georgia State. And of course they used to serve food at Hurt Park down here, and he stopped doing it. He just couldn't keep doing it. And he also said that the younger group were looking for food in dumpsters, and he said he wouldn't serve that kind of food to homeless people. So he dropped the group.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they were doing a lot of pot smoking, which, you know, there is a law that if you can take away property of people who are involved in pot smoking or selling, and he said, well, they could take away my house if they found people. You know, the police, it's hard to believe, but I know that they do take property from people who are involved in pot arrests. So all these people know each other in various ways. It's quite amazing, the web of people who have worked for the Bird particularly, and have been in the music scene and the art scene and all this stuff. I forget to drink my coffee.
Yeah, in many ways Atlanta is a small town, or maybe everywhere is like that, and there are just a lot of cross currents and crossovers, overlaps.
That's true. Like even in a city like New York, you'll find people that know. You'd be surprised how they know all these people. Like there's a big fuss now about David Hawkins. What's his name? Hawkins? No, it's an artist.
Hockney or?
Hockney, yeah, that's right, David Hockney. Well, when I hear it immediately, he was also gay, like a lot of people, but one of his partners at one time is also a very good friend of mine from New York, and the guy that got me the job teaching at Rutgers, when I had to have a job to prove to the adoption people that I could support an adopted child. It was really good because it led to the jobs here, and it was a good job, up to my skill level. Anyway, Mark Berger, my friend, had really been dropped Hockney was quite a, what shall I say, pushing himself ahead at the expense of his friends, including my friend Mark. And I can't remember all the details, but there were a lot of hard feelings about David Hockney coming as an Englishman and taking advantage of the, what do you call it, the fact that Englishmen are supposed to be specially talented or something. And I know that Mark and a lot of other artists were quite annoyed with David Hockney. So I can't hear David Hockney's name without calling up, frowning faces. And his great success, according to some, was really on the backs of other artists, so to speak. Now, this is just what they say. I have no opinion. I'm not a fan of his work, actually, so I can't say I'm. But that's all I know about him personally is what I've heard from other New York artists. So even New York is full of these, everybody knows somebody else, Like, there was a lot of people, being swingers in New York in the 60s, and one of the biggest swingers was Bernstein was known as, the big swinger. That's another detail you don't hear when they're now deifying Leonard Bernstein, but he was right there like everybody else, in the scene, whatever it happened to be at the time. And that was, of course, it was fun about New York is that nothing truly was sacred. And there were no real heroes. And Hockney, of course, and like there was Allen Ginsberg, who was, of course, been deified over and over again. And he, of course, was just another New York character to a lot of us. He had given up writing and just was high all the time as far as we were concerned, and sat, saying Om Mani Padma Hum, and playing his one-note thing he had. And while the scene went on in other places, it was more interesting. It's like my parents were in Paris when Hemingway was, and of course Hemingway is a great writer, and my parents went to bars where he was, and they said they never knew him because he wasn't very interesting. He always sat, he was a great writer, but apparently not the party guy my parents would have liked to, knew. So he was in the back, sitting in the back room sort of thing, just drinking. And my mother and father and my grandmother were much more interested in a, more active, whatever that was, singing and shouting. I don't know what they did. It was more fun than what Hemingway did. So Allen Ginsberg had become sort of this kind of person, at that time in New York, and there were newer people that were more interesting and vibrant than Allen. I didn't know him. I never really even met him. I met his partner, Peter Orlowski, a lot, but who was more interesting and more fun. As far as I was concerned. I wonder if Peter was also an artist. I can't remember that. I don't know.
And where would you run into him? Just
anywhere around Tompkins Square Park, or at concerts, or there would be poetry readings and art shows and stuff like that. You'd see these people out. The main poet at that time was Ted Berrigan, who had a sort of group, and that's like, if we belonged to any group, it was Ted Berrigan's friends. And there were several women whose names I don't remember, but whom my wife knew, and published some poems in their mimeographed poetry magazines. And Ed Sanders and the Fugs were sort of one of the main cultural. Leroy Jones had left this group the year before and gone to Newark and changed his name to Amiri Baraka. But he had at one time been sort of part of the Ted Berrigan circle of poets. Another person in that group was Aram Saroyan, who was the son of the writer, what was Saroyan's first name, who wrote My Name is Aram. And he then had a son who he named sort of after his novel, the book. That was a little bit funny.
Mm-hmm.
So Aram Saroyan and Ted Berrigan and several other people were in this group, but I can't remember. So when we came to Atlanta, it didn't take us long before, with this addition of black culture and Atlanta politics mixed in, because certainly we had no part in New York politics. But we had moved to Atlanta partly because we knew that the black people were taking over power. We could see it coming. It was clear all over the country that this was going to be the first black mayor was coming. And so we thought this maybe is the right city for our interracial children to grow up in a city where the black people now have the political power. And it was good. I mean, I'll never be able to figure out if it was or wasn't, but it had to be better than a city like Baltimore or Philadelphia, where the blacks are still struggling, I mean, to get any sort of power. Mm-hmm. And Atlanta is still in the hands of mostly, and produces people like Stacey Abrams and, of course, a lot of black crooks too, like, what's his name, Campbell. Mm-hmm. But that's bound to happen anywhere. God, we're really going racing far afield.
Yeah, but it all circles back.
It sure does. You know, even I'm surprised as I talk to you at some of these connections, like my friend Bob Darby and Dolores French, and that's and Burl Boykin, John Jacobs.
So in the last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about the great speckled bird, and you mentioned that you already knew of the bird before you had come to Atlanta.
Oh yes, it had a national reputation, mostly just because of its name. It was so peculiar in terms of other alternative newspapers. I didn't know any more than that about it, though.
And had you, in New York, or maybe even in Chicago, had you been reading other underground papers or contributing at all?
Boy, that's another really good question. In the early 60s, if there was an underground paper in Chicago, I didn't know what it was. And however, like the early 60s, we were waiting for the late 60s to happen. We didn't know that, but that's what we were doing. And preparing, sort of, for that to happen. So, a guy I knew in Chicago, I don't know what Dick did for a living, actually. But there was a guy that had bought a coffee shop a few blocks away from Northwestern, and there was a bookstore across the street. The bookstore was called Great Expectations, and the coffee shop was called No Exit, obviously meant to call up thoughts of Sarge. Anyway, so because it was a bookstore and my wife was a writer and I read too, we of course went there and found people, made friends there with various people, often people in the philosophy department, other teaching assistants and people like that. And I ended up playing, I don't know if it was every week, I don't know how much, but playing at No Exit coffee shop. So of course, I knew the owner, and I wonder if I was paid. Yeah, I think I was. And Dick had started a weekly newspaper called the Old Town Voice.
And Dick's the owner?
Yeah, Dick McKiernan, and he had this newspaper and needed people to write for it. And so I started, both I and my wife and several other people started. We never got paid, but it was fun to do, and I got to write anything I wanted and draw pictures, and it turned out that he actually wanted to run for office in Chicago and was using this paper as a PR vehicle for himself. And he was a Republican, but we didn't care. Some of us just were happy to have a good time writing and drawing, very much like what I was later doing at the Bird. The paper finally, when he ran for office and lost, he lost interest in the paper, but by this time we were about to leave Chicago anyway. But it was a little bit, it was slightly avant-garde in the sense that the people that wrote for it did whatever they wanted, and I published all sorts of weird stuff, and it just for the fun of it to see what.
Do you recall any of the pieces that you produced?
I have them all at home.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I wrote a story about 3 women that I'd made up named Penny, Nikki, and Dolly. This is so stupid. But it was some sort of really strange, what should I say, not Dada, but it was so obviously some sort of avant-garde writing inspired by people like, who was the poet, of the Dada poets and stuff like that.
Mm.
And drew pictures of Chicago fantasy architecture, and yeah, I had a great time. And my wife wrote cooking articles that were often ridiculous. Like one just said, buy a pizza and get a bottle of wine. That was the article for that week. And then we described how we took it home and drank the wine, ate the pizza, and woke up an hour later, actually with our faces sleeping in the pizza plate. And this guy, Dick, just didn't care. It didn't matter because he had this other goal, of gaining, I don't know what sort of people he thought were going to be attracted to him by reading what we wrote. Another guy wrote music reviews, but got into only writing about records that had now been discontinued. So his article was just a long list. It was so dumb. But funny, if you wanted to take it there. We wrote movie reviews of Ingmar Bergman movies, panning them very often because we said Ingmar was using the same actors over and over, and you got tired of seeing these, one picture he was this, and the next picture he was something else. It was very unfair and really sort of adolescent behavior of all of us. But it really prepared us for the late 60s. We were ready to go, anywhere with any idea whatsoever. The Bird was quite rational compared to the stuff we wrote for the Old Town Voice. One time, Old Town was this part of Chicago that had become very popular, and then, of course, very expensive, so nobody could live there anymore. But these are the people, Dick, this was the district he wanted to win, get his, and it was also, there was a Japanese, what do they call them? A store selling, a trade store, they stole Japanese stuff and one of my artist friends said, there was a woman in the Second World War who was a traitor to the United States and broadcast from Tokyo to our soldiers and telling them, you know, quit fighting, you know, you don't want to die for the United States. And she was called Tokyo Rose, and she was really good because she'd grown up in Chicago and spoke perfect, you know, she was probably born in the United States. So she was really sharp, and she played American jazz and stuff. Well, when the war was over, I don't know what happened to her, if she was punished. Because once one of our artist friends said, you want to meet Tokyo Rose? And Ronak and I said, yeah, I guess so. So we went down to Old Town and went into this, what was it called? I forget, Taguri's Japanese trade store. And we walked in, there's this elderly woman behind the counter, and from a distance, our friend says, that's Tokyo Rose. And it was, because her name was Taguri, Rose Taguri, and this was her father's shop. And she was not in prison, she was back in Chicago selling chopsticks and stuff in Old Town. That's a bizarre story. Because I used to sing a song at the cafe. It was written by one of these parody guys whose name was, there was one guy named Tom Lehrer and then another guy who made up funny parody songs. And this song went, I'll bet you're sorry now, Tokyo Rose, sorry for what you done. I'll bet you're sorry that you went to work for that old rising sun. You stuck a knife into the USA. You forgot what they learned you out at UCLA. Da-da-da-dum. I'll bet you're sorry now, Tokyo Rose, sorry for what you done. So here I was singing this song in Evanston, the next suburb, and here was Tokyo Rose working in this. She obviously had gone to UCLA. I didn't know. All I knew about her was what was in the song. You stuck a knife into the USA. Oh well. So there you have it. That's where the bird leads you.
Yeah, and so if you had this background of anticipating the later 60s and working at this paper in Chicago when you were in New York, and underground papers were really sort of in their heyday.
Oh yes.
Were there any that were
No,
your favorites, or that you
no,
really...
I had no interest at that time. I was so busy painting. I mean, I had put an ad in the Village Voice that I will paint anything, and got practically only replies from gay guys that just wanted to talk about it on the phone, about how I would be on a scaffolding painting like Michelangelo. I don't know where in New York that was going to happen, whose apartment was going to look like. And I would say, yeah, I can do that. And they say, my people and I will be posing below. And I said, okay, you can do that. And they say, we'll all be naked. And I said, sure, that's fine with me. And said, you'll be naked on the scaffolding. I said, yeah, I can do that. And nothing ever came of it. You know, there was no such address, or there was no phone number to call. It was all about that conversation. So I got so tired of these conversations. My friend Mark Berger, who had been a friend of Hawking, who was himself gay and had a motorcycle and wanted to sell his motorcycle, he put an ad in the Village Voice that said, motorcycle for sale, simply, whatever it was. And he said the only calls he got were from guys that would call up and say, hello, is this Mark? And they say, yeah. And they say, Mark, you got a motorcycle for sale? And he said, that's right. And then they say, do you like leather, Mark? And he'd think, yeah, I like leather, okay, what do you mean? He was himself taken by surprise. I say, we could get together and, do some stuff. And he said, no, I want to sell my motorcycle. You didn't get the message. And so he was completely frustrated. I guess he sold it eventually, but all the calls have been were just about, well, let's talk about leather. Do you like leather? Mm-hmm. Somebody said that to me too, about this painting. They started, I said, you're the guy that'll paint anything. And I said, yeah, and then the next statement was, do you like leather? And I would be taken aback and I'd say, yeah, I guess I have a leather hat, a suede leather hat. But I don't like leather like the way you, oh God. Anyway, that was, another guy calls me up and says, I want you to paint my Carmen Gia. And I said, who is this? He said, Ford Krieger. I said, Ford Krieger, what a phony name. You're just another jerk, that's calling up. And he said sort of pathetically, no, that is my name, Ford Krieger. I said, yeah, well, tell it to the Marines. And I said, what Carmen Gia? You don't live in Philadelphia. I was really annoyed with this sort of stuff. And so he said, I'm going to send you bus tickets and you should come and paint my car. I said, okay, you do that, sort of. But by God, there were the tickets, and my wife and I and my daughter, was about 3 and 2, took the bus to Philadelphia, and there was the Carmen Gia, and I spent 3 days sitting on the curb in front of a Philadelphia row house, painting the Carmen Gia.
For Ford Krieger.
For Ford, and he was an interesting guy because his father was a well-known chemist in Philadelphia who was developing poisonous stuff for the United States government. And there were lots of protests against this, including by his son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter, in which they would walk down the street pushing a little girl who was my own daughter's age, with a sign saying, stop my grandfather from, creating, poison, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And we knew the Ford and his wife and went to spend a weekend once on the Jersey Shore with them. And both our babies, our little kids, got diarrhea, so the whole weekend was spent cleaning up cribs, and that was, I don't know what. The car eventually was, somebody said, abandoned along the highway somewhere. It looked like a Mickey Mouse watch on wheels. Anyway, that was another New York experience, part of the Philadelphia experience. And I don't know what's become of Ford and his family. I have no knowledge.
And how did you paint the car?
I painted pictures of him and his friends, sort of portraits, using just regular house enamel. The car was already red, so it was a great background. So I met his friends and painted pictures of them, and painted pictures of his wife, and all over, so it was it had a very active look. It was not tiny LSD designs all over it, like a lot of people did. It was much bolder. That was the kind of painting I wanted to paint for these jerks that called up and made up these stories. One, oh God.
So this is not directly related, but when you mentioned that Krieger's father was manufacturing different types of poisons, it made me think of like Agent Orange or...
Yeah, I don't know what it was at the time. Might have had something to do with that. I have no idea. I didn't pay attention to what it was. It was something I'd never heard of before.
But it made me think, were you already old enough that you had aged out of the draft when Vietnam?
Yes. I would have been drafted in 1952 for the Korean War. My friends either went to Korea or to the American Occupation Army in Europe, but I had asthma as a kid, and they would not take anybody with an asthma history, so I was 4F never joined it. But most of my friends, the male friends, spent at least 2 years doing one thing or another. One got a Purple Heart and his ear was nicked by a bullet. I only laughed because it was good it didn't hit him, it wasn't worse.
Mm.
It was my students at Rutgers who were all of draft age or being about to be drafted. Or then I came to Atlanta and met people who had been in the Vietnam War, other artists, not so many. And my friend Bob Darby, the guy I talked about who knows Dolores and has just gotten married to the woman from Nemaha and did Food Not Bombs, was very anti-war, grew up in Vidalia, and became really persona non grata in his hometown, where everybody, including his father, brother, and thought he was a traitor to the United States for not going to Vietnam. And he had had a friend from Vidalia killed in the war quite early on, and it wasn't that he didn't want to be killed, but he didn't want to take part in a war where the people like that were being killed for no purpose that he could see. And when Bob went back after many years, a couple of years ago, to a reunion in Vidalia, he was actually afraid of this happening again, to go back and get into a fight with his classmates. And I said, I thought that after all these years, they're just going to be happy to see you. But he took me along like a kind of bodyguard, and I was supposed to, I don't know what I was supposed to do to defend him. And the minute we got there, these people were so eager to see him that I just stepped into the background. And it's just the way I said, that it was all water over the dam, or under the bridge, or wherever it goes.
So, let me look at my notes here. Your years of being most active at the Great Speckled Bird. Here you list that you were the culture editor in 1975, and you had moved to Atlanta in 1970?
Yeah, and I taught at Clark through 73.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I did after that really was the Bird. So it must have been, and it was just before it ended. And it was at the time that it moved from Juniper Street or whatever to North Avenue.
Okay.
I was in that first office on Juniper Street, if that's the street, the right street.
It was on Juniper for
Okay.
a while. Mm-hmm.
And it was there for maybe a month or a couple of months. And then we moved, and I left it before it moved to its last place, wherever that was.
In Little 5 Points.
Yeah. So whatever time that was the time I was
Yeah, it might have been 74, 75.
Yes, somebody, I wrote about this in my Facebook, and somebody I know wrote back and said, well, her boyfriend, whose name I cannot remember, unfortunately, had worked there and didn't remember me at all. So that was a little, I know I was there. And I wish I could remember, I'll look that up for you, whatever that guy's name was. But he was not a staffer, it was a person, she said he wrote restaurant reviews, whatever his name was.
Mm. There were so many people in and out of the
Right.
Bird, and particularly over its 8-year run.
Absolutely, right.
So had you been reading it at all before you joined as a staff person?
Oh, I'm sure I did. I must have known about it and read about it. I mean, of course I knew about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I thought it would be a good place to work. Exactly why I went there, I don't know. There was probably something that triggered it, but I don't know what that was.
Maybe just that there was an open position.
Could be that somebody said, right, offered me the job. Maybe that's what it was.
And so what were your responsibilities as the culture editor?
The main ones were receiving there would be an ad. I got all the news about musical events, of which there were endless ones. And one of our main advertisers was Alex Cooley. And every day that kept the Bird going, in fact, was his ads, which would be a column this long of musical events. And I always got free tickets to everything and was expected to write about a certain number of these. Now, I was not so interested in that music scene, but I did write about art shows and other events like that. And so that was my job, is to cover cultural things that seemed appropriate to what the Bird, to its political interests. And then we would often there would be protests and stuff like that, and I felt I could cover that too. Like if they had a protest at Emory over some military show that they at Emory had foolishly put into their library, called the Digital War, what was it called? The Digital War Game Board. Boy, was that something we got excited about, and all went over with signs, and I wrote about that, and that would be something I'd write about. But I did get used to getting free tickets to all events, theater and musical events. It was very hard afterwards to pay for anything, because I felt that why should I ever pay for anything again? Why couldn't I go to concerts? But I was not writing, other people wrote about it. We had plenty of people writing reviews of musical events. So I had to sort of coordinate that, decide what it was I thought should be published by contributors too. I didn't write all the articles about reviewing. We had lots of people that wanted stuff reviewed, that would review it themselves.
As well as film reviews.
Yeah, film, absolutely. And we did not attempt to cover everything. We just couldn't do it. We covered the things we thought were like the protests about raising the fox and stuff, were cultural issues we felt we needed. Although that was sort of problematic, since the fox had a racist history, was not all good, but certainly tearing down anything in Atlanta was something we were sort of against. We were pro-culture in general. And we did not get involved in tearing down Confederate war memorials. It was not an issue, but they were tearing down a lot of historic buildings. They shouldn't, still are.
Do you recall who some of your fellow colleagues, staff members were at that time?
I would see people for other reasons, protests, even recently. And of course, recently there have been more reunions and stuff like that, where I will see people like Steve Wise and the Coffins and others whose names I can't remember right now.
But were they still involved in the Bird while you were there, or was it sort of
Not
a different
so much.
set of people?
No, yes, Stephanie Coffin was, only that she would be at these protests that I would cover. She was not doing anything with them for the Bird. She was there as a protester. So I would meet them at events like that, although they were no longer staff on the Bird. And then, of course, these people, as I said, all had children of my own, and I would then get involved with them. Like the Coffin's son was a sculptor, and I would go to sculpture shows, and even long after the Bird was over, I would still meet these people at shows that I would be in. Sculpture shows, suddenly there would be somebody from this past group, maybe a new generation. So these people continued to be part of the scene. of the art scene in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Who were the fellow staff people during the year?
Well, Krista Brewer, of course, was one. John Jacobs was, of course, the main one. And the manager of the office, oh damn, of course, I know his name so well. Oh, God. Was also the boyfriend of one of my kids' teachers in the alternative school scene, which is a whole nother scene, as they say,
Mm-hmm.
also involved with many of these same people. Doyle Neiman, his name. He was, I think, the office manager or something, was, and John, myself, Krista, and I can't remember who other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing that whoever.
Oh,
was
it probably also wasn't a huge staff at that.
Well, that's
That
probably
time.
the reason. But I remember John once or twice crying at editorial meetings about something. That was a little odd, you know, a little odd. Like something I didn't think was happening at the Journal-Constitution.
Mm.
But we expected anything, everything was fair.
So what were the staff meetings, or at the time, were they still having sort of open meetings for all contributors or interested
No,
parties?
well, yes, sure, if anybody wanted to come, but most people didn't want to bother to come to it except those of us that actually put the paper out. So the staff meeting would be me and John and Doyle and Kristen, whoever, and we would decide what was important and who had articles to put in the paper. And that's when they would say, well, you know, where's this article about the police? John, and John would say it isn't ready. And they'd say, well, what are we going to do for our feature article? And I would say, you could have one line. They say, no, culture shouldn't be a feature. It should be like political. And I said, well, mine, it can be plenty political. And twice, 2 or 3 times, there was no other article but mine to make the feature article. And then they would get mad the next week that they had just used a feature article. While I sat there, they would say, this is terrible, the Bird. But, you know, I was used to that. If you're going to work in a place like that, you have to be pretty thick-skinned about stuff. But it was business. It was how to lay the paper out, and all these articles would be typed and printed, typed on pieces of paper, which we would then lay out on a layout, you know, glue them, and photographs would be sent to the printer to be changed into whatever, I can't even remember. And we would lay out a lot of this stuff right there. There would be a room where we did the layout, and all of us worked there. I mean, all of us learned how to do that. I spent many hours laying out stories, pages, and then you had to lay out advertisements and figure out how that all fitted together.
Were you aware of, you were mentioning the sort of resistance to having a culture story as the main feature. Were you aware of the long history at the Bird of this tension between the hardcore political people and people more inclined towards culture, counterculture?
No, the only kind of thing I witnessed, except in my own case, were the political issues between the people in terms of their political beliefs. Like, when Bill had worked there, I guess you could say there was a certain male gay culture. I can't say because I wasn't there, which changed to a lesbian culture. all the time there were different kinds of communist cultures. There were arguments between Marxists, Leninists, and Stalinists. I mean, which I was dumbfounded by, I understood, but these people were really mad at each other. And so if there were tensions between the gay guys and the lesbians, there probably were, but there were tensions between personalities all the time too, which got mixed into the political thing, definitely. People just got mad at each other. I mean, I won't go into it, I was mad at people often for things that had nothing to do with their politics, but the way they were behaving in the office or what they were doing with the newspaper. And so that was always there, is stuff like that.
And what would be like a root cause of?
Well, personality problems, people that were overbearing or made what you considered a foolish decision about layout or about the paper or something. I mean, it could be any sort of work problems they could be. Then came the political problems. Then came sexual orientation problems. Well, this problem with me and the editor at that time about Dolores strippers was a complex problem because the woman as a lesbian and a feminist, I mean, she thought that these women were being exploited, and yet here was another woman bringing this in as a sympathetic to these sex workers, and here I was a guy taking the side of the woman who was, I mean, it's a complex problem, excuse me for, so that it's hard to characterize that problem. It could have been a personality problem too, because the editor, the woman that quit, was a very bossy person. And she didn't like anything that didn't have anything to do with gender problems. It's just that she was a bossy person. And it's like John Jacobs was overly emotional and would lose track of stuff because he would get, as I said, weepy about it. And that's not a gender problem. It was a John Jacobs problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I had problems with people because I thought that they were ignoring important stuff in the paper for reasons I didn't even understand. I mean, why? I couldn't say it because they weren't communists or were communists. It's just sort of workplace disagreements. Or somebody drank too much. That was a problem. I won't name anybody, but I felt that, and which affected me a lot, being the child of a drunk.
Mm-hmm.
I was particularly annoyed with that, as getting in the way of the paper's purpose as this person who was, I felt, drunk and incompetent at that moment. So that was another issue which could take place anywhere, not just the Bird.
Right.
But with this overlay of gender, politics, it became things became, I mean, it's amazing that anything got done, that there were these people who were so actually there was a kind of unity about the purpose of the paper that did keep people together, mostly, working even in situations they found, in some cases, obviously almost intolerable. But they were willing to, and none of us were getting paid anything finally in the end. I mean, we were living off of Alex Cooley's ads.
Mm-hmm.
Because the creative loafing came along, and because they'd give it away free, it became popular with everybody. And they had no, apparently, political standards at all, and which disgusted all of us.
Mm-hmm.
They were not the only paper. There was another paper, oh God, what was his name?
Rick Brown.
Rick, what was his paper called?
Gazette?
The Gazette, maybe that was it.
I'm just guessing.
You know, there
like-
was another paper, God, it'll maybe come to me. It was not the Gazette, it was something else. It didn't last very long, but it was several people from the Bird that started. It was more cultural, it was supposed to be. Oh,
What was that Rick and Liza's paper? Maybe I'm wrong on the name.
No, Rick and Liza, that's correct. But it wasn't that, it was another paper with somebody else's name. It may come to me and it won't happen now, perhaps. The guy, I can see him before me as what he looked like. It was not Steve Wise, no. Or was it? Did he have a newspaper at any time?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either. I don't know. I can't remember.
You mentioned that it was that it's remarkable in many ways that the paper existed at all and was able to continue
Yes.
as long as it did, and you said because of its underlying purpose that everybody believed in.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe or characterize what that underlying purpose was?
Well, that there were some progressive issues that shouldn't be ignored. And they might not be issues that everybody agreed on, but everybody felt that they knew some issues, and most of them we did agree on. I mean, even though I criticized the Fox Theater's existence because I felt it was my duty as a socialist critic, I, of course, believed it should be saved just the way they did. I also believed that somebody should, Neil Herring, that's a person, but he was often not, he didn't come to staff meetings, but he wrote about, the Georgia state government. We all agreed that somebody should be there keeping an eye on people like that. There should, and that the AJC wasn't going to do it, and that we would be the ones that did it. It was our duty to follow these things that would be ignored. A lot of things we ignored because we had our own short-sightedness or didn't know about them. Like we weren't very good at following black culture or black politics. I did the best I could, but that was agreed that would be something we would do, definitely. There was nothing against it. It's just that a lot of people were simply not in touch with it or ignorant of what was going on. But I think that's what we agreed on, that there should be a progressive eye on all this stuff somewhere. And to some extent, Maynard Jackson's regime put an end to this in a way. Once there was this change of power and racism was not as flagrant, I think that the Bird lost its steam a little bit, and that happened all over the country perhaps. I'm not sure about that. That's just sheer speculation. Because all the other alternative papers had already quit years before, and the Bird somehow didn't notice that had happened, that they were now the only alternative newspaper in the country. And then, of course, later came papers like The Onion and stuff like that in Chicago. I mean, suddenly I don't know if they're what there are now, but there probably are alternative newspapers now that I don't even know about. Are there?
It's an interesting question because how do you define what
Right.
an alternative
Right, they have
newspaper
a different style.
and do things that are solely electronic online?
Yes,
You
you
can't-
said a newspaper.
Right.
Well, actually, I've talked about the two things I thought I wanted to talk about just because they did fit in. the naked stuff, Ingmar Bergman's influence on artists and writers, and how the black arts entered the Atlanta art scene.
Mm.
I think that's really important, how that happened. I certainly saw it happen right in front of my face. And there aren't so many people left that were there, I mean, black or white.
Right.
John Riddle is dead many years, and I think that John Eaton, who was the assistant director, is, I think, still alive. And you could find some people to do that. Well, probably plenty. But getting them to tell you is the problem too. Yep.
So what was decision making at the Great Speckled Bird like? You mentioned that there were these staff meetings, but you also mentioned, like, with the issue of the feature you did on strippers.
Well, it would be majority decide. I mean, we'd have to, if everybody wanted to do, most people wanted to do something, we'd do it. Nobody ever held out and said, no, I'm going to quit. Well, this woman did quit, yes. Oh, sometimes it would come to showdowns,
Mm-hmm.
but that wasn't often. It didn't happen in the last year I was there. There weren't people that took that kind of stand.
Mm-hmm.
So when we made decisions, it was mostly a group decision. There certainly was no boss, there was no, for a socialist group, we couldn't have anybody deciding for us. So I get used to that, so that every place I worked, in fact, when I went to the neighborhood arts center, the director said to me, he said, you don't have to get everybody's approval. This guy said, I'm the boss here, I decide. And you're going around advocating all the time. Well, that's what I got at the Bird. Everything had to be advocated for to get the group to agree, but at the neighborhood arts center, he was right. John decided, you could advocate for somebody, but he made this. I didn't have to go to the rest of the staff and get a majority on my side in order to get something done. Too bad I didn't, but that's the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I've kept that attitude even now when I worked for this circus. We had a boss, but I still went around and tried to get everybody to agree to something before I proposed it. Still the smart way. And then the boss would say, no, I don't like it, and I'd get mad, furious, because everybody else did. Stuff like that.
Right. About how many hours per week do you think were required of you while you were working at the Bird?
Well, pretty much a full week's work, a 40-hour day, a week. I must have gone every day and worked there. I had to be there to get stuff that was sent in. I suppose I could skip an afternoon, but I think I worked there full time. We all did. Except for contributors who just came in with something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And certainly the day the newspaper was put out, I mean, we all had to be there. Actually physically take it out and put it in the boxes or send it. It had to be sent by mail a lot of places and delivered to stores that handled it.
And would everybody have a hand in that?
Yes, absolutely.
Not just Doyle, who was the office
we all
manager.
We all had to do it. Like, each of us had a duty at least once a week to go out and help empty the money out of the boxes. And then fix them. I mean, they would get broken. We had a whole row of broken boxes next to the office, that we dragged in. I mean, that was, and I think there was somebody in charge of that, but there's a guy named Alvin Burris.
Burl. Mm-hmm. Alvin Burl.
Was it Burl?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, Alvin. He was a very nice guy. And I don't know, I think whatever his job was, that was among them was.
Yeah, I think he was.
Is he still around? Have you talked to him?
He is. I've
Oh my
done 2
gosh,
interviews with
that's
him.
amazing.
Yeah, he.
Yes, he and I were really good friends. When I would, now another guy's name, I see him, but I can't remember his name. He had red hair and worked there the last. And when I would get mad at somebody, he and I would go out and have coffee and he'd calm me down. God, what was his name? It'll come to me. But Alvin wasn't writing articles, but doing something else.
Yeah, he was largely, I think, in charge of circulation.
That's what it was, which meant fixing boxes and stuff.
He told me a lot about what that, the tediousness of that.
Yes, that's right. I'm trying to remember this other man's name. It doesn't come. Name some other people from that time that is there anybody I haven't?
The pickings are slim for those years of
Mhm.
who was involved, or just who people can recall were involved, because so many of the people that I've spoken with were involved in the earlier years.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I have talked to Alvin and Doyle and
Where does Doyle live now?
In Maryland, just outside of
somewhere on
DC.
that coast. Right.
There was no, I'm drawing a blank. Well, there was Alvin and then Mickey Kahn, Henry Kahn.
Henry, yes, of course, I remember Henry. Yes. And I've seen him since.
Yeah, they're both still here in Atlanta, but I'm trying to think of a woman's name. Who was a school teacher and went on to be a professor of education.
Hmm.
Yeah, it might come to me, but she.
Mm-hmm.
So just a handful of folks that were involved in the final years.
I'm trying to think of the woman who I think married Doyle. Was one of my kids' school teachers at the Peachtree Alternative School. Oh, Patty and, oh God, oh well, that's not exactly on the track. It would come to me.
Can you talk some more about the ways that these different identities affected work and the mission of the bird? Like you mentioned how sexuality, or actually maybe it was just an interpersonal disagreement with this one editor, but you also did mention that that segregation was still so strong in the city.
Well, there were no black people working for the bird.
Right.
That was a fact.
And do you have ideas of why that was, or what
Yes.
challenges there were to
Yes,
overcome?
because all the people working there were not connected with any organizations in which there were black people working. They simply, even this alternative school where there might have been, if there were black students, they would be interracial children or adopted children like my own, but no black parents. So that's the reason that there weren't black people. There were no people working in black institutions. That's the only best way I can put it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like the minute I left the Bird and joined the Neighborhood Arts Center, I immediately was in contact with lots of black people because I was now working in a mostly black institution. And it was the same when I had been at Clark. I knew lots of these people and worked with them and that. So the short period I was with the Bird, I was pretty much out of that scene, except at home in my own neighborhood. And that's the main reason. If white people don't work in an integrated business or institution, they will probably not have black associates or friends. And that was, even with the most progressive people on the Bird, they would not, I'm just thinking, through very quickly who knew whom and like, I can't think of any. I take people at the Bird and I go home with them, so to speak, in my mind,
Mm-hmm.
and think, were their friends? And the answer is no. I can't think of any black people I met through the white people that worked at the Bird. Like Dolores strippers, none of them were black. Although there were black strippers, obviously, in town. Well, it's the best I can say on this subject.
I did think of the woman's name that I was trying to think of, Teresa Secules.
Teresa, no, I don't know her. That's not, although that sounds sort of familiar,
Mm-hmm.
the name Teresa.
But she was involved in the later years as well.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So why was it that you left the paper? Was it to join the neighborhood arts group?
I don't think so. Although it's possible, I just can't remember. The Bird was obviously on its last legs, and no money was coming in. That was a good reason for quitting, that there was no longer a salary, but that wouldn't have stopped me. So I may have thought it just isn't worth it anymore. I mean, we're not doing our job anymore. There was no idea that I didn't like them, or there was no personal problem that I remember like that. It had something to do with it's time to quit, time to do something else or
Mm-hmm.
something.
I did also want to ask, it just dawned on me. So if being born in 1930, when you're working at the Bird,
Mm-hmm.
you're in your early to mid 40s at this time.
Right.
Was that noticeable? Was that something that sort of affected your
No.
work there when most of the other
No,
people
no,
were probably in their 20s?
That's a really interesting question. And yes, sometimes I might have had experiences because of my age that they hadn't had. But mostly was that I knew things they didn't have, like I knew I had read a book about socialist art criticism. Now, I could have read that and been still 20, so that had nothing to do with my age. Strangely enough, I don't think it figured in anything. It was completely not an issue that I remember. I never felt I was too old for them or them too young for me.
Right, your worldviews were
No,
aligned,
right,
and that mattered most.
right.
Is there anything?
And that's why I'm still friends with these people. I mean, we meet at protests. We have, like, I meet the Coffins or Steve Wise, or because we still think alike like that. We still have that bond, actually.
Yeah. Is there anything else about working at the Bird that you wanted to discuss? I'm looking through my talking points, and
Right.
I think we've covered.
I have the feeling I've said pretty much everything I have to say. There may be some anecdotes that I've forgotten or don't seem important, but I think this idea that we really had a group goal is an important thing to know about the Bird. But finally, when we began to be ineffective, I think that's when I felt we were ineffective, or that my skills were not worth applying or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think other people stopped too because they had other things to do. You know, they couldn't work forever for nothing. I'm trying to think through all that. But it was not because they no longer believed in it. That was not a reason.
Right. Were you involved at the time and in the decision-making process that as the creative loafing came and advertising, you mentioned how much you relied on money from Alex Cooley and other sort of record companies,
Right.
concert promoters,
Right.
that a lot of that money was going over to the competition at Creative Loafing. And so I think that the Bird went free.
That's
and
the
then
reason for stopping, is I saw that happening. And I felt personally that we had taken a wrong financial direction. That we should have become free too immediately. And the idea of sticking to paying 25 cents or whatever it was a mistake. But it wasn't just that. I mean, I could have lived with that, but it was wrecking the paper. It's true. That was a bad financial decision. And that may have had to do with why I didn't want to continue.
Yeah, and others have said that the impact that the end of the war in Vietnam,
That's a very good point. I didn't think
that
of
there's
that.
not that
Right.
point of coalescing.
Right, and the political situation in Atlanta was no longer, fighting the redneck sort of, anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It was gone. But I think the point about the war is very good. That was no longer a cardinal issue.
And so did you leave the Bird, do you think? Because the last issue appeared in October 1976. Do you think that you had left by the end of 1975, maybe, or?
Probably.
Yeah. And we've talked about you working with the neighborhood art center and then looking at your biography. You note that you had an individual artist fellowship for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and several solo art expositions in New York and in Sweden, working
Yeah,
for the
that
Urban
started-
Design Commission,
Right.
Nexus. Do you want to discuss any of that?
Yeah, that was really, I decided I would concentrate on my career as an artist. So, which began with the Neighborhood Art Center. And when I got, the Neighborhood Art Center also, of course, came to an end for reasons of funding, and people were leaving that already too. So that was not my own decision, but that had finally it was just John and one other person were working there. And I had gotten this fellowship, which of course helped encourage me to continue doing that. So I started looking for other shows. I mean, I just started to push myself, and I had connections in Sweden, and there was a lot of movement in the art scene suddenly among Atlanta artists in what's called the mattress factory shows, in which they took an old mattress factory on MLK, and every year had a show in some old warehouse. That was the beginning of this warehouse show stuff. And these were mostly students from GSU, mostly students of you know, the sculpture.
George
Beasley.
yeah.
And that went on for several years, and all of us sort of prospered through that. And I started doing performance art, and we did it at those shows. And I mean, that was, the 80s was like the golden decade of Atlanta performance art, not just me, but there were all sorts of venues, the 688 Club and the TV dinner and places. That's when RuPaul started, and more gay people got into it. And finally the 800 East Gallery, there was a string of galleries and places, and then iDrum, which were all part of this really enormous art movement that was going on in the 80s and into the 90s, which my wife and I wholeheartedly took part in, and all my artist friends, and Ronald and I went to Europe, and we had shows in Sweden of Atlanta artists, which we pretty much arranged.
And was she also a visual artist or
she was a
performance art?
part, but she became a performance artist when we started doing our acrobatic poetry act. I taught her how to do acrobatic stuff, and she became quite good at it, partly because her family were also interested. Her mother had just missed being in the 28 Olympics as just a performer because she was too short. But she was a gymnast. Her aunt and her father had been a college gymnast. And so we had a background of athletics in the family, actually. So she turned out to be quite a good performer. And we did that for about 10 years up until her death. In the meantime, I mean, she's in all these pictures in that book, of course. We started doing that sort of thing. So Atlanta art was, at least in this certain group, was pretty lively during that time, but still quite segregated. I mean, it was hard. A lot of black artists were exhibiting together, but we're still not sort of, there is still a big divide, as there is even today, among these artists. That brings us to today, of course. we had an integrated group in this, a diverse group it's now called, in the Inman Park Festival. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to be in it, is that we have a guy who's from Morocco and a guy who's an African American. And even with only 2 people in our 7-person group, we displayed diversity in an otherwise pretty white festival. And that's sort of where I'm at right now, is trying to continue having an acrobatic group which crosses race, gender. One of our people has now declared himself as a female name.
Mm.
So I guess he's changed from Joshua to Jacqueline. And a lot of people have trouble with that. Other people have changed their names in our group, not for that reason. Suddenly somebody named Laura became Nova. Obviously she wants to be a new person, to call herself Nova. And now Douglas, Joshua is Jacqueline. And as Nova said, I'm really good at changing names, immediately using their new name. But I think back to Bill Cutler and Duncan Aswell. And then my wife said, she said, but women are always changing their name when they get married, you know, so what else is new? But people have trouble with that. They amazing. People that see themselves as quite liberal or have a hard time. Well, another guy was Luke and now he's Lucy. And that went pretty well, but so we have these things going on all the time in our own group that we have to change. Excuse me for laughing, but it's an issue that I see as a non-issue. Personally, I'm so interested in just seeing that people are out there performing and doing their best, that whatever they're called. Andy doesn't mean, I must say I don't care much about it, you know, okay, now you're Jacqueline or Nova or somebody, you know, okay, so that's who you are. My wife said I shouldn't be Steve anymore. When we moved here, I should have my formal name of Stevens, because she said that people in the South like that. They like names like Stevens, and I'd rather be Steve. Every time I get a thing in email for Stevens, I know it's somebody that doesn't know me, and I don't have to
Right.
write it. Steve. So anyway, I mean, it's all going on, the same thing. It just moves to different planes somewhere, you know, so now we're doing this or that. I will have a grandchild graduate on Saturday from Oglethorpe University, which is a big, strange thing for me. I mean, this guy, he's done the whole thing with a full scholarship. I had to help him with some things, but it's amazing he managed to do this. And that his mother, my daughter, managed to get these kids. And her daughter's graduating from high school the following weekend. So I have to stop thinking about acrobats now and then and go to a family party at Longhorn restaurant or something, or go to my great-granddaughter's 3rd birthday party. And this whole bunch of people that also are a whole world in themselves, and a bunch of characters that I have to readjust to, and have no obvious connection with my life that we've been talking about. Mm. But once you start to talk about them, you realize they do. They will somehow creep in. And I have a grandson who's a rapper, and you know, eventually this will become part of my life story. I don't know how, but something.
So your daughters both still live locally here in the metro Atlanta area?
Yes, that's right, in the area. And the person that was quite important in all of this is Alice Lovelace, who I haven't mentioned because she was not connected with the bird, nor was actually connected with the Neighborhood Arts Center, but a rather formidable force politically in all of this, and somebody I worked with constantly when it came to city stuff, projects, and she was a good friend of my wife, them both being poets. And her daughter, of course, grew up with my daughter, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we have all these other connections. And she's now the director of the Arts Exchange, which is in East Point, and I simply haven't been over there. But a lot of the stuff we did, even with the circus, took place at the Arts Exchange, which was on off of Glenwood, and was like Nexus, a place with artist studios and a stage, and also had artists, diverse artists in it, both black and white, and has another history that somebody should eventually pay attention to. But I never had a studio there, never really was part of that sort of career-wise, except using their auditorium sometimes for performance and things like that, and knowing the artists that have studios there.
So, were you and Roanoke both largely self-employed, or for much of your?
That's a good question too. We managed somehow.
Yeah, because looking at your resume,
there's sort of empty.
There are periods where
there are empty spaces.
Yeah.
Well, that's when she worked, Andy. That's right. We somehow managed. One of us would have a job, and then I would be at home with, say, the kids, or I'd be doing. So suddenly, Roanoke became an artist in residence for the state of Georgia, and would go off, and those were for several years, would go off and spend 2 weeks in Thomaston teaching poetry in the local schools. And I would be at home taking care of kids or making art or something. And somehow we managed to scrape by with this you work and then I work thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was teaching at Clark, she was at home taking care of the kids. And when she was, I don't know what I was doing, the kids were practically grown up when she was a poet in residence. So the same is true prior to that. And before that in Chicago, we would both work, like we both worked at the Museum of Natural History. And when I was a graduate student, she, like many graduate student wives, worked in the library, the university library, with all the other strange people. So it's interesting you noticed that. Yes, that was sort of, I look back and think, God, how lucky we were to manage to exist like that.
But also I notice, and it's possibly a misreading, but your trajectory from the 1950s just keeps going through the present. Like, there's not a point where I look and I'm like, oh, you retired here.
No, Andy, there's no retirement moment. And this is part of not retiring, is coming over here, talking about this. Yes, I often think of people that, live in retirement home. I guess I may eventually become incompetent, but there's more to do than I can handle. Like, even going on this trip to Santa Fe, my friend's daughter is a psychotherapist, and immediately we started to talk about psychotherapy and human pyramid building and how can we connect that. And it seems like there's always some way to put it together. And I've learned a lot from her, and she's really interested. I keep contact with her about what she's doing. I mean, Santa Fe is a very swish place in some ways, but there, of course, is an underclass of Native Americans and Mexican Americans that she deals with constantly, people with depression and race problems and whatever. And I keep finding new things that are, I think, just utterly fascinating. When I see these young people do these acrobatics, I mean, their athletic ability is absolutely amazing. I mean, I'm so pleased to know people that are that clever and that I can even help them learn more as a coach and do a better job. I mean, to see them perform in that parade is just amazing. I mean, they're walking, standing on each other's shoulders, and this Moroccan guy, Raid, is doing front somersaults over 3-4 people sitting, lying on the ground. He runs down the street, and this band that we've managed to get together, many of whom I know from previous lives, so to speak, are playing down by the riverside, which suddenly I see has a political edge. You know, lay down my sword and shield. So we, in a way, are, you know, doing a political act with my friend who's now impersonating Donald Trump somewhere else in the line, as this guy does front somersaults over people lying in Euclid Avenue. I mean, this has got to be, yeah, I go home and I think, what a bore to be at home where I have to paint the front porch and, you know, do stuff like that and, you know, take baths and all the stuff I'm supposed to be doing. And so, and then I'll have a class tonight in trapeze, and I've missed a week, so I'm going to be a little, not quite as sharp as before, but suddenly one of the guys in the trapeze, a young man who's studying to be a doctor, but does aerial silks. It's sort of unheard of. He's a real tall guy, doesn't look like an acrobat, but he's very good. And he suddenly decided we should all do ground exercises, like get in push-up position and flip over into back and then, you know, continue doing this stuff. So I started going online, finding more exercises. So tonight I'll come and say, let's do this. And I'll scarcely be able to do it at my age, but by God, it is so exciting to try to do this stuff and see other people who are like 18 years old, 18-year-old girls. And then another guy is almost as old as me. God, he must be at least 80, maybe 82. He's still doing trapeze too, and we're sort of in competition, you know, who can do the hardest stuff. He usually wins out because he's younger. He's 6 years younger than me. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of my life now. And you brought up so many other almost intellectual issues, trying, you know, thinking out what we were doing with ourselves at that time, or what you're doing here now with the archive. Like, I think it's great that you have an archive here, and there must be other things you do besides interview people from the Bird.
Some, but this is my favorite thing.
Yeah, me too. Although tomorrow I'll have to do another, one of my other favorite things, and then Friday I will meet my friend with his new wife from Iowa.
That'll be exciting.
That's going to be, I don't have any idea what that's going to be like. And of course my friend that I went to Santa Fe with has got some sort of cancerous growth in his eyes, and that's always a background for all of us. My sister-in-law called me from Sweden, and of course she can't go to her summer place now alone, which is a big thing in Sweden. You've got to have a cabin in the woods somewhere on the beach, because she can't shop for herself anymore. She can't ride her bicycle. And she's now 92, but sounds as if she was, well, a young 60 still. And still, the family bully, the oldest sister in the family. And she doesn't bully me because I'm like the oldest and an only child. We're like two only, but she's really a smart person. I shouldn't pick on her. Oh God, I'm on camera too, I shouldn't say. Annika, forgive me for saying that. But I've learned a lot about big families from my wife's family. But there are also people like that are still doing stuff, and she's giving a reading and a book reading today or tomorrow, and a book by my wife, and I mean, that's just...
You mentioned that last time.
And of course, they want me to come to Sweden, because it's a big party when I arrive, and we just have a good time. But even in Sweden, I have to figure out, why am I here? What's my job now? You know, who should I... So I have this idea that I should get the family together to do a big musical thing, like on the street somewhere. And I don't know if they want to do that, Andy. I don't know if my opera singer niece really wants to go out and, you know, it would be like going to Woodruff Park with your whole family and doing a concert, whether they like it or not. And some are hot for doing this, but others are not quite as excited. So I have that project coming up.
But you're the elder statesman, so
you
get to decide.
Yes, I do have that power. It's a little bit, that Annika and I, that's my sister-in-law, we do have a certain power, the way she did over her sisters. I mean, I've seen her, you know, exercise this power over my wife, who was a younger sister, and sort of horrified, but I realize I can do this too. But there are lots of people playing guitars and violins and artists. I mean, they're just the perfect group to, you know, get out on the street somewhere. But it's going to be work, and I think to myself, why am I not just sitting watching Netflix or something? You know, why do I bring this on? Why do I have to go to Inman Park? Well, it's the way, it's to be alive. That's what it's about.
Mm.
It's staying alive. And if I can just outlive Trump's regime, I'll be, you know, happy. But even that's become unimportant to me recently. I've gotten so interested in stuff like this that politics seems dull almost, to trying to remember who was on the Bird back in 1975. Or trying to get people to go to the park this weekend and practice throwing each other in the air. You know, I'll admit that it's scary stuff I think of for them. And but I've been scared too. I've done it. And I've had coaches that say, hey, you're going to learn this today, like whether you like it or not. And I go, boop, and I do it, and I learn to do it. And so I've become sort of in my old age, you know, pushing youth to do beyond the borders of... Andy, I'm just blabbering now. I've come to the end of my usefulness to this.
No, and
unless you can
I
keep
think
asking
that, I think
questions.
that you're actually right on, because you mentioned that politics is becoming less interesting to you, at least at this moment in time,
Right.
Which I wanted to ask. So what are some ideas or ideals that matter to you right now?
Well, I think when I watch people dance, this sounds so impractical, but it's so much fun on YouTube to watch people do folk dancing or anything from all over the world. They get so involved. I mean, you can go anywhere. Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, the awful Saudis still, and even though they won't dance with their wives, they're still pretty funny when they start to dance these line dances. And I sort of think if all of us could just do stuff like that together, like acrobatics. That's what I'm trying to do with this workshop in a month, is to try to at least get a discussion started about how we can do non-confrontational and even physical things with each other that will make us more interested in doing that with each other than being apart. Even on the plane coming back, that I thought was going to be so boring, the three people, and then we were so different. One was a so-called, I hate to use the word expression, black, because people really aren't black. As an artist, I know perfectly well that's not a color people are, But this woman who was a nurse from Baltimore, and this guy who is I'm not quite sure what, from Santa Fe, and me, got absolutely excited about talking with each other, you know, and we're not quite embracing each other at the end, but we become these friends. You know, we bonded, and that happened on the train. There were suddenly a whole bunch of Amish people sitting, women with these little knit caps, and guys in these slightly ridiculous haircuts and red suspenders. I mean, it's like a group that had an act, you know, with these, but they were really terribly nice and strangely enough willing to talk. I didn't talk to them about, I just heard one guy saying, yeah, we can't take airplanes, but we can ride the train. So here are these people all sitting in these chairs watching, you know, the landscape Kansas go by, and it was so much fun to sort of know them. I mean, I'm sure you could get into arguments with them about something, you know. You can get into arguments with everybody about something, but everybody was so excited to be on the train and having such a good time. And I've seen that happen before, riding trains, where people would get in a dome car and start to tell stories to each other. And you start to eavesdrop. I mean, my friend and I were listening all the time to what the Amish people were saying. We were so curious to know what their lives were like, and if, you know. And then a guy sits down next to us who's practicing some rap song, a black guy. And that's like another world, but we're all sitting together within inches of each other. And then the waitress starts to call me Papa, and she's either Puerto Rican or maybe Filipino, but she starts, when I'm not eating something, Andy, she walks by and just pushes it in front of me without looking at it. And then she comes and says, you haven't eaten your tomato, she says. Like I think it's none of your business. I'm not your grandfather or something. You don't have to, but I mean, it's all sort of fun, you know, we're all having such a good time. And then the guy, our porter, whatever he is, our attendant, starts calling me Steve, and I wonder, how do you know my name? I mean, why am I, and I'm with a guy who's got a doctorate, he's a PhD, and I think he's probably going to call him Dr. Knespel, and I'm Steve. You know, how did that happen? But this is like the hope of everybody, that we can have a good, all you got to do is know the other people, and you start to have a good time with them. I mean, if you knew an immigrant, you wouldn't want them shot, as now some people, Trump's people want to do. I mean, you wouldn't do it. Americans are really good, like when they have to meet somebody, of getting along with them and actually being helpful. But at a distance, they seem to have no imagination of what it's like to, say, be an immigrant or be anybody that's different from them. And I don't know where this comes from, if it's poor education or what, but it seems that when they do find themselves with these people, they manage, you know, like if somebody's about to be shot, you throw yourself in front of them. And that's sort of an American attitude. Mostly, there are a lot of people that will do that, and I often think that if we can just, I don't want to throw myself in front of people who are being shot. That isn't what I mean. I want to avoid the shooting, and I believe that no American man should be able to have a gun. I mean, just let's make a general rule that nobody gets a gun if he's a male American. That'll take care of that. The women are not going to shoot people. So anyway, I'm trying to feel out right now what my belief is, but this is pretty much what it is. If we can just start to think of ourselves all as one family, you know, friends. It's hard to do with Prince Mohammed bin Salman, but, you know, like Donald Trump is hard to love. That's what I say to myself. You know, if he's going to continue behaving like that, I can't really love him, but I would like to, in a kind of sense that people are always saying, I love this, I love that. It comes really easy to Americans nowadays to say, I love you, I love that. And let's really do it then. Let's really, believe in it. That's it, Andy. I gotta find a line to the end of that talk. And
That's perfect.
And I know you guys all agree with me. I don't even have to ask you, that's generally what people I know think. Certainly those people on the plane. We were finally shaking hands in some sort of, it was like some acrobatic move. She reached across and he reached, and we were all, I don't know what we were supposed to do once we're in that group, we're stuck in these little seats. It was very funny. Yeah, the woman moving the food in front of me, like, Steve, you haven't eaten your breadstick.
Eat your vegetables.
That's right.
Well, I thank you so much for coming in again and giving all your time to this. It's really fantastic.
Well, of course, I obviously enjoy it. I continued talking in Santa Fe to the point that I thought I better try to control myself, including talking about what we've been talking about.
Well, good. I certainly enjoy it. And as I said last time, if you think of more things that you want to discuss,
yeah,
let us know. We'll set up another meeting.
Showing you this book had a purpose. Is there anybody here that's interested in stuff like that? I mean, from...
Like stuff like this,
yeah,
this book right here.
From Atlanta's culture world, so to speak.
We should talk to Catherine about that.
Because I have things like, I have some catalogs that I brought along from art shows that even I just barely remember, but are obviously quite important in many ways. This is a children's book my wife did with actually Bill Cutler's cousin as the artist, a story for my son that she made up. And here's the program for a show that we did in Sweden with all Atlanta artists.
Oh, yeah, you were mentioning this.
Yes, that is a story, of course, that goes with that cover. But here, too, is a book. I even don't remember this show. But somebody got this show together of partly artists that we knew at the Neighborhood Arts Center that went to Sweden. And we got somebody to pay for this print show to go of all black Atlanta printmakers. And just to simply remember their names seems to me quite important. Because as I say, even I had forgotten this show, and perhaps some of those people.
Well, let's wrap here, and then we'll go upstairs and we can talk to Catherine, because I'm not sure whether Georgia State, there are places that are most appropriate for certain kinds of things, and as an archivist, she will have a good idea.
Okay.
But I agree with you completely that they're important. Again, thank you. We'll stop recording now.